Right now, more than ever, graphic design is all around us. Words and pictures, the building blocks of graphic design, are quite literally everywhere. They're the elements that make up our interface to both the digital world and the printed world. And as graphic design elements become more prevalent in our lives, graphic design as a practice becomes more important in our culture, and there's an increased need for more graphic designers. Graphic design is a really broad field. It can take many forms. You can be a graphic designer and just make books or logos. You could design web interfaces or t-shirts, chocolate boxes or political posters. But what all of these specialized areas of graphic design have in common is that design is being used to represent a product or an idea or a message and convey that to an audience. Design is a way of communicating something to someone else through visual means. There are many different types of graphic designer. Some are very technical, some very formal. Some have a practice derived by research or concept, and some are driven purely by style or aesthetics. Others by the desire to experiment. But they all deal with controlled communication through text and image. Sometimes designers just use image, illustration, and sometimes they just use text, typography. But mostly designers use a combination of the two, tied together by the use of color and composition. In this course, I'd like to try and reduce this vast and varied practice down to some fundamental skills. These are the building blocks you need to master in order to be able to eventually build something more complex and refined, and they're going to be relevant to pretty much every specialized area of graphic design. We're going to break graphic design down into its basic components: image, type, shape, and color, and then we'll look at composition, where we put all the elements together into a composed piece of graphic design. By breaking the larger practice of graphic design down into these smaller areas, we can examine how each of them works and learn about them in greater depth. I don't just want you to watch a video of someone talking about design, I want you to make design, to get your hands dirty, to get excited about making. So this fundamentals course is going to be a practical one. I'm going to show you visual examples of the things I'm talking about, and I'm going to have you make some of those same things. After all, if you want to be a designer, you have to be a visual person. You have to be a maker, either a maker of meaning or a maker of form, or preferably both. By the end of this course, you will have tasted the core aspects that make up the practice of graphic design. You'll have experimented with image making, tried your hand at typography, and learnt about color, shape, and composition. Hopefully, you'll have acquired an appetite to develop those skills, a desire to continue to build your skills, with the ultimate goal of becoming a successful graphic designer. To begin this course, we're going to look at image making techniques. Many graphic design practices involve image making, and these images often work as literal depictions. The image represents the thing itself, and we call these kind of images denotative images. For instance, let's say I make an image of an apple. It sounds simple, but how that apple is represented can say a lot to the viewer. The technique used to make the image of the apple, the aesthetics of the image, well, that can say a lot about the apple itself. It can make the apple look healthy and delicious, or rotten and disgusting. So how the image is made becomes very important. The designed image says something about the actual object, about what kind of apple it is. The designer is adding extra information and communicating that information to the viewer, and this can have a big effect. In this case, it might make the difference between whether you want to eat the apple or not. It gets more complicated as you begin to change that denotative or archetypal image and pair that image with other elements. And when designers do this, the apple is no longer just an apple. It can represent or suggest a different idea, and we call these kind of images connotative images. For instance, if we put a mortarboard on the apple or a test grade by the side of it, then that apple becomes about knowledge. If we put a few lines indicating the apple is falling, you could read that as being about gravity. One half red, one half green, that could be about good and evil. Or a snake wrapped around the apple, well, you might read that image as being about sin or temptation. In this course, we're going to make images that are both literal and metaphorical, images that are denotative and connotative. We're going to look at some of the formal strategies and techniques used in image making, and we're going to do this with a spirit of experimentation and embracing ideas of process. And what this means is We aren't necessarily looking to see who can draw the most perfect apple. Graphic design isn't always about perfection. Quite often it's more about making the unexpected or the original. And we're interested in everyone being able to investigate a broad range of making techniques, to generate their own images and to really enjoy the process of image making. So I want you to give yourself permission to make in this loose and generative way, to really enjoy the process of making. I think you'll make some images that'll be beautiful, successful, and surprising.
What is denotative image making? Well, it sounds quite complicated, but in fact denotative image making is the simplest kind of image making. Let's say you're making an image of an object. Denotative image making is when you make an image of that object and it is exactly what the object is. Your image is an exact representation of that object. There's no other meaning attached to it. It literally is what it is. So for this project we're going to look at some everyday objects and we're going to use those as the basis for some image making techniques and skill development. So let's start out by looking at a few good ideas for what those objects might be. So here's a very denotative image of a pencil. It'd be quite hard for a viewer to look at this and really get any other message from this image other than the fact that it's a pencil. A lot of denotation is really trying to get the essence of an image, trying to strip it down to its core communicative value, and that's a useful skill to have as a designer. So here for instance is a pair of glasses. Again, it'd be hard to read that as anything else. Other good objects for this project might be something like a cup, or perhaps even a pair of scissors, something where it's an object that has a range of possibilities but also has a level of simplicity to the object. So you could use something like a bunch of keys, perhaps a corkscrew, or a shoe. I'd pick something that is an everyday object, something that's just lying around the house that you can use, something that has a level of simplicity to it in terms of how it can be represented visually, but also has the possibility for a little bit of complexity as well. So it could be a pair of headphones, or the object that I'm going to use for this example, which is an apple. When you make an image of an object, a denotative image that is, the first thing that you have to really think about is, what is the essence of that object? How do we recognize this image, for instance, as an apple? Well, it's partly the shape, it's partly the color, the texture, it might be the proportions of it, and it might be that it has certain elements that help us recognize that it's an apple and not something else. It's important to understand that a single object can exist in many different states and still communicate itself. So for instance, here's half an apple. It has very different signifiers, very different things that tell us it's an apple than the first image, but we still understand it. Now the pips and the stalk and the shape of the apple communicate much more than just the skin of the apple and the shape of the apple in the first image. And we can break that image down to an even smaller segment and it still be recognizable as an apple. We can even use the pieces to make up a new whole and still understand that it's an apple, and we can also change our viewpoint. If you think of yourself as a camera, you can move all around the object and see it from different angles. So the apple in real life can exist in many forms or states, but the apple as a representation, as an image, well, that also exists in a lot of different states, but we have to make that, we have to communicate that to an audience. And we're making marks here as designers and as illustrators, so we have to understand, well, what's the essence of that object? How am I going to make a mark on a piece of paper that's going to communicate that to an audience? So here's our half an apple again, and we still recognize it as an apple, but now it's got a visual style to it because the image has been made by a designer instead of photographed in a realistic way. And here we can see just a part of the apple, the core of the apple, standing in for the whole, but we still understand that it's an apple. And the designer is controlling the communication here, and you can see what happens when it goes wrong. Is this an apple or a cherry? It's hard to tell because the designer hasn't really got at the quintessential aspects of the apple and communicated them to the audience. Instead, there's some elements that can read as a cherry in there, so we get confused. And what's making this image confusing might just be as simple as the relationship in scale between the stalk and the body of the fruit. And part of the designer's job is to control those messages, control those visual cues that might mean other things, and make them mean the thing that you want them to. And later on we're going to look at how you can deliberately mix those messages and use them to your advantage. But for now, let's stick to denotation, and let's try and unravel all the different ways that an image of a single object can be made. When we make a denotative image, we also have to take into account the kind of form that we're using to make that image. So here's a fairly denotative view of the apple, but it's also been reduced down to a kind of denotative image quality, if you like. It's a very simple line drawing, just drawn with a pen. The outline of the image lets us know that it's the shape of the apple, and the stalk lets us know that it's an apple, and maybe the scale relationship between the stalk and the apple. So even without color and without volume, we can get the message and we can understand that it's an apple. You could add volume and dimensionality to that apple, still by just using black and white and gray and cross-hatching here, but suddenly there's much more information. Now we understand it's an apple, and it's still a denotative image. The apple is just an apple, nothing more, nothing less, but we start to see a lot more details in the image. And we could use a similar technique and give even more information by adding color to the image. So gradually the image has gone from being very little information held in the denotative form, in other words the way we made the image, to a lot more information held in the form. And that amount of visual information really correlates to an image being photorealistic or an image being iconic. If we go back to our line drawing of an apple, we can look at this as being a very
Right now,
as a camera, you can move all around the object and see it from different angles. So the apple in real life can exist in many forms or states, but the apple as a representation, as an image, well, that also exists in a lot of different states, but we have to make that, we have to communicate that to an audience.
these images often work as literal depictions. The image represents the thing itself, and we call
So what's going to make your images different? What's going to make them compelling? You could spend a lot of time meticulously making an image, or you could create a process that's much more inventive, one that's going to generate images that perhaps aren't already out there, that nobody has seen before. I would encourage you to try making in a lot of different ways. Try different techniques and different processes, whether that's things that are digital and on the computer, or whether it's things that are done by hand, or a mix of the two of them. Eventually it'll be really useful to spend some time refining some of these images and really mastering a technique, but for now it's much more about generation and about iteration, trying to make a lot of things, have fun, and get some kind of energy and enthusiasm going in your image making. So with most of these image making techniques we're going to look at, we're really interested in your process rather than creating a perfect image at the end of the day. So how do you get started? I would say just dive in, just start making images with any materials that you have at hand. Don't worry about your images being good or bad or very finished or not. Just make something. The worst that's going to happen is you make an image and then you can refine it or react to it, but at least you'll be making. A good idea is to start out simple. Just basic shapes, easy line drawings, simple materials and simple form. Not everybody can make an image that's as complex or maybe takes as much formal skill as this, but anybody with even basic drawing skills can make an image that works like this one. And anyone with even rudimentary computer skills can make an image that looks like this one. Think how you can be clever and inventive and interesting as an image maker, rather than just being polished and refined. And the easiest way to get started is just to start simple. Draw the image in the simplest way you possibly can with the simplest tools. So here you can see the image of the apple is reduced to a single circular form and with a stalk and a leaf, and the color plays a very important signifying role for us to recognize it as an apple. Experiment with a lot of different tools for mark making. Even though these images are all line-based, the tool that the line is made with has a great effect on what the image looks like and how the image feels. The quality of the line can be seen in the tool that makes the mark, but also in the gesture that you're making. Think about how your arm is moving and how your hand is moving as you make these lines to represent the object. Your lines could be very loose and organic, or on the other hand, your lines could be much tighter and more graphic. You could have a line that feels a little bit more naive or a little bit more primitive. Or perhaps you use your line as an image making strategy. This apple, for instance, is drawn with a single stroke of a ballpoint pen, the pen never ever leaving the paper. You could also think about your images having no line quality at all, and just working with volume. Here the image has no outline, it has no linear qualities to rely on to define its shape. Instead, it uses texture and weight. It becomes very gestural, but even without the description of the line or without color, we can still tell it's an apple. And when we start to use color with the idea of volume, you really get a sense of what the object feels like in an expressive way. Here, the designer uses volume to describe the outside of the apple, but the lack of volume actually describes the inside of the apple, the white flesh of it. Small details, like the pips and the stalk, let us know that it's an apple and maybe not some other kind of fruit. And in this image, you can clearly see how volume works without the linear definition to contain it. Here, the color is blurring out into the background and really leaving us with just an impressionistic view of the apple. This image is also relying on color as a primary means to express that the object is an apple. And this can be exaggerating even more by emphasizing and overemphasizing both the scale and the saturation of the color. So here, our recognition of this object as an apple really relies on the fact that we recognize this round shape that's red with a small leaf that's green as being an apple and not something else, even though we can clearly see it's made out of other elements that have other meanings. So if we were to revisit denotation for a moment, we could think that perhaps if this leaf on top of the apple was in a different shape, then perhaps we wouldn't read it as an apple anymore, we'd read it as a tomato. So what we're really trying to get at here is, how do you make an image that gets at the essence of your object? Another aspect of image making to think about is cropping. What this means is how close up to or how far away you are from your image, and this determines exactly what you're going to see of the image. So here, for instance, we can see a close-up of the apple, but we can still determine that it's an apple. There's still enough visual information there to let us know what it is. So sometimes it's useful to think about, what is the closest that I can get to my object and still represent it in a recognizable way, versus what's the furthest away that I could get from my object and still have it be recognizable. And this notion of recognizability can be really pushed in image making, particularly in an exercise like this where you're making a lot of different versions of images of the same object. So for instance, this image might only really look like an apple in the context of you seeing it as in a group of images with a bunch of other apples. On its own, you might have a hard time recognizing what it is. But that's okay in this instance, because part of what we're trying to do here is get you to experiment with different techniques, and they're not always going to work. So try things that you don't know how to use. Try things you haven't done before. Maybe for some people that might mean looking at technology and trying to use new programs that they may be uncomfortable with. For other people it might be getting more hands-on skills and working off the computer. But try whatever you can and just really experiment and just see what happens. Part of what I think is valuable about this kind of visual experimentation is that you really push the boundaries of denotation and understand where they lie. You're really testing, when is this image going to break down and stop being readable as the object that it was intended to be readable as? When does this apple stop being an apple? Another aspect of image making that you can think about is texture. We quite often think about things being very flat in a digital world and having a pixel texture. But if you're making images by hand and with objects and paint and raw materials onto different surfaces, quite often that texture can be much, much more important. So sometimes even the simplest element, the simplest representation of that object with a little texture can be really interesting. And one of the things that can accentuate the texture of an object or of an illustration can be a contrast. So here we can see there's two different ways of making this image. There's the soft crayon line, but then mixed with this very rough and textured collage element. So the contrast is actually what's giving the texture or making the texture be visible. So often it can be really interesting to take different processes and different kinds of materials and image making techniques and mix them up, mix them together. So maybe take something you're very familiar with and something you're less familiar with and see what happens when you pair the two. And one of the best things about this is quite often the images that you make can end up being quite surprising. And again, surprising to the viewer, but also surprising to you as an image maker, and that means they get to be fun to make. And quite often, the more that you can mix these different ways of working, and the more unexpected the work becomes and the image making becomes, then the more original the image becomes. And you start to make things that not only surprise yourself, but they're images that you probably haven't seen before, or you haven't seen them made in this exact way. And that's really great. It starts to get at an originality and starts to get at you developing your own personal style and your own way of image making. And trying to get at this idea of originality or an original way of image making can quite often mean that you have to do some things that might surprise yourself or seem a little silly. So here, for example, some of these images are made by not taking the pen off the piece of paper, or by deliberately drawing in a naive way. Or here, for instance, these drawings are made blind, so the designer, the illustrator, isn't even looking at the piece of paper while they're drawing. And again, here the image is made by just one continuous line without taking the pen off, but it's in a totally different style. It feels much more like a contour map as a way of drawing the apple. Be inventive and try and think of strange ways to make images, and that can sometimes be taking a low-tech or guerrilla approach to image making. So this image, for instance, is made just by putting the apple core straight on the scanner and scanning the image without really knowing what it's going to come out like. Or here's the same idea with a different low-tech device. Here the apples cut in half are just placed on the glass surface of a photocopier, and again, what's great about this is you can get very surprising images very, very quickly. In this segment, we're going to look at three important aspects of image making: process, generation, and iteration. And these are much less about your skills as an image maker or as a designer, and much more about how can you develop some strategies to be productive and generate a lot of material when you're making images. So let's first of all look at process. Process is how you make images, the steps that you take in order to make them. So rather than thinking about image making as a very literal, direct process where you have a clear idea of what the image should be and then you make exactly that image, process-driven image making really lets you experiment along the way, quite often without an idea of what the final outcome is going to be. So for instance, we might have an idea of a process for making this image, which is to cut an apple in half, to put some different colored paint onto that apple, and then make a print using the apple itself as the object that we're printing with. Now we might have a fairly clear idea about what this image might come out like, but we couldn't possibly predict exactly what the image might look like in all its details. And if we start to add more steps to our process, so here for instance is the image overprinted a couple of times, we actually start to get even more interesting results. And there's no real way that you could have visualized these results in the first place. You could have had a rough idea of what you think is going to happen or how you might want the image to feel, but the exact details are really down to the process itself. So here's another example where the designer made the shape of an apple out of some pieces of cardboard and then used those pieces of cardboard as a plate to make an image from by either coloring the image in or by rubbing over the image. And while the shape of the image might be quite predictable, the haloing and the texture really is less predictable and comes out of the process, it comes out of the making. And you can see that's accentuated even further when you start to have multiples of this image and have them interact together, where suddenly the negative space and the texture is even more accentuated than before. And one thing that's great about process-driven work is that you can use it as a way to make a number of images. You can make the images as the process progresses. So for instance, here's a woodcut where you can see it's an apple core and then here's a later version of the woodcut where there's even more cut away. And so by making different prints at different times in the process, you start to get a range of images, and then you can go back and look at them and pick which one you really want to use. Iteration is your friend in any kind of image making. And what iteration means is just that you make a lot of variations of the same thing. You don't just make one image and be done. You actually redraw the same image, try and remake it, rework it, make slightly different versions of it. And what this is allowing you to do is to really test drive your images, so that you make them and you look at them and you can assess which ones are working and which ones aren't. And sometimes the easiest way to do that is really to look at the image and say, well, is this one better than this one? And you have to have two comparative images in order to make that kind of decision. And part of what iteration boils down to is the fact that you don't always get it right first time, so it's useful to have many opportunities at making the same image over and over again. Just think about it like takes in a movie, or recording a song and having to record little pieces of it over and over again. Sometimes you have to do the thing 2 or 3 times in order to get it just right. One of the great things about iterative image making is that every time you make that image, you're actually practicing and you're really increasing your image making skills. So it's a really good way of mastering a certain technique, because you're forcing yourself to really participate in that technique over and over again. The third aspect of image making that we're going to look at briefly is generation. What we mean by this is just making as many objects as you can, just trying to continually make and to learn from that making as a continual process. So don't get put off if you get stuck or if you're having a hard time with anything. Just move on and try a different technique or a different way of working. Part of this is about acknowledging that there's no single correct way to make this image. We're really looking at you to try and be inventive, try and experiment, and try and gather a really broad range of skills, and then be able to apply those skills later on to a number of different projects.
Hi, today I'm going to make some prints by using an apple and directly using that apple to make the prints. I'll cut it in half and then apply ink to the apple and then print using those 2 halves of the apple. So first, I guess I'll cut the apple in half without harming myself there. And then I have some watercolor inks here, and I guess I'll just directly apply the watercolor inks to one side of the apple to start, and not use too much water because the apple already has some water in it. Okay. Then I have some papers underneath my main paper here just to give some cushion to the print. I might try using some stamp ink, some red stamp ink, and overprint that really quickly, just to try to get some more color into it. So I'm just inking up this apple using an eraser to transfer the stamp ink onto the surface of the apple. Okay. And just printing right over that last print. And the colors, are a little nicer. I might just get a second print just directly of the stamp ink to kind of just get a sense of the shape of the apple. So that's kind of nice because it still kept some of the color from the original watercolor ink, but it's primarily that nice stamp ink that's left on there. So I might try just inking up a new side of this apple with some different colors. This is a little pink. Try not to get too much water in the watercolors before applying it to the apple because there's so much water in there already. It's kind of almost dry brushing. Might try another without inking again. That's kind of nice, but it's a little too hard to see. So I might add some more color to this. Let's see. Try to add blue for a nice contrast with this light pink. A little darker to get a darker impression. roughly painting on here. Okay. Again, I'm going to try to overprint on one of the last pink impressions. I try to get some darker color, darker blue. Might even try mixing colors directly on the apple. Get a kind of a gradient. And again, I kind of like this overprinting, the look of this overprinting, so I might just might print right over that other print again. Need a little darker around the edges, maybe try to get some depth in the print by just painting one of the edges darker than everything else. Let's see. Print's still a little wet, so I might try to print that again on a new sheet of paper. Print that twice, and then maybe I'll take the other apple with the stamp ink and overprint with that to get the contrasting colors and shapes of the two different apple slices, or two different apple sections. Just quickly ink the edges. Just an overprint. And we'll try one more. I see it transferred some ink from the paper back to the apple, which could be cool. Try one more print. Yeah, that kind of has the same effect of transferring the color, the watercolor, back onto the apple, which I used in this new print. And it could be cool just to try an apple cut the other way, kind of along the latitude of the apple. Just get that contrasting shape in there. I think this is ink both with stamp ink, just oil-based stamp ink, and also some watercolor. That's kind of nice because it's kind of faking the dimension of the apple a little bit. So I'm going to try to finalize some of these prints with some oil pastels and some just colored pencil. Maybe add in the leaves, the stems, the seeds, to kind of maybe denote more of an apple from these prints. So I can start making a little leaf shape, kind of getting the outline of that. And maybe put in a little stem here. And then finalize it, maybe put a couple seeds just in the center. Using some charcoal, maybe use a couple colors there. And then just working in those leaves a little bit to add some depth with a second green. And get that stem back on top. And maybe I'll work into these ones with the colored pencil instead of the oil pastel. Go back in there with a lighter green. Maybe I'll still use the pastel for the stem. And the charcoal for the seeds. And then go back through maybe a black stem. And a couple seeds to finish it off.
I'm going to make a print by cutting apple shapes from this duct tape. I will put this shape on a paper and ink it with this oil-based stamp ink to make a plate. These materials are easy to find and you can do it from your home. First of all, I'm just gonna cut this. I'm putting on my cutting mat so I can cut a shape out of it more easily. So I'm just cutting an apple shape from the tape. And to make it look more like an apple, I'm gonna cut a little hole. And I'm putting that on a paper. And I have this ink, oil-based ink, and I'm applying it on that shape that I just cut out. And take another new piece of paper and I'm gonna make the print out of it. So I just put it on top of what I just made and by rubbing it, hoping to get some prints out of it. And I think we have a little apple print here. I want to make a little more of apples with it around it, so like make it a little group. I have some of these like pre-cut apples here. And here I'm composing them together. And yeah, we're missing some stem. And maybe some of them have a leaf on it. Maybe one apple can be the side way. Put one more here. A little for that one too. And let's see what it looked like. Print. Take a new paper and rub it again. I'm putting some pressure on it so I don't miss any shape from that I made. And I have some apple prints here, and I know that I use this for to make this print, but I kind of like this base too with the orange tape with the red ink on it. So I have another apple print here.
Okay, I'm going to try some quick iterations using this simple apple line drawing. And what I'll do is I'll put it on the window so we have some backlight and we don't need a light table. And then I'll overlay some paper on top and just try different techniques really quickly. So first I guess I'll try something maybe with a brush with some ink residue on there so it's kind of a dry brush effect. First kind of get the general shape. Get some orange. Water on the brush. the stem. Maybe that's one quick apple.
Yeah, I'm gonna pick some sort of like apple-like colors and then just pull them all together and maybe trace it. Let's see. Do the drawing multiple.
I think now maybe I'll use this kind of fat black oil crayon. Just kind of get very rough apple in here. Could be as quick as that.
Just showing the volume and the shape of it.
Just getting some more India ink on the brush. Just black ink. Give it a little dimension. Gouache on this. Let's just try to mix the two techniques.
Apply a lot of some accents.
Oops, need a little more ink.
In this next section, we're going to look at connotation with images. Now, we've already looked at denotation, and we described that as being, it is what it is. In other words, as a designer, we might make an image of an object, and that image directly represents that object. In other words, it is what it is. The image of the apple can only be read as being an apple. But connotation works in a slightly different way. It's when we start to want to suggest something else, or build a metaphor or an idea, and that can obviously be very useful for designers in terms of communicating something more complex. The dictionary defines connotation as an idea or feeling that a word invokes in addition to its literal meaning. But as designers, we're also dealing with images, so we're going to also be looking at how images evoke in addition to their literal meaning. So let's go back and think of our apple. When we'd looked at denotation, we'd looked at making an image of that apple in the most simple means possible. And one of our simplest denotative images was just the line drawing of the apple. And it's very hard to read any other kind of meaning into this image other than the fact that it's an apple. The form is really not very ambiguous in any way. It can't be read as being some other shape, some other thing, pretty much all we can read as a viewer from this image is an apple. So how do we make the apple do something else? How do we make the apple mean something else? Let's look at some examples of what kinds of connotation we can build from the apple, what we might have to do to the image of the apple in order to tell those stories. One of the examples that we'd looked at earlier was the idea that the apple might represent the choice between good and evil. For instance, in the fairy tale of Snow White, the wicked witch gives her an apple that's half red and half green. So if we think about that as a cultural context, as a reference that people understand, or a lot of people understand within a given culture, then we can start to use that to build meaning. In this case, we can construct this image that instead of being just about two pieces of an apple, it becomes about choice, or again, about good and evil. Now we could also create that same kind of idea, that same kind of context of good and evil and Snow White, by actually thinking about adding another element to the apple. So if we look here, just the fact that the apple has a bite out of it, and then the hand is laid down by the side of it, that suddenly tells a much, much larger story. So we're really telling that story by adding an additional element, by giving some context to our narrative. If, for instance, we were to take away the hand, we'd be left with a totally different image. Without the hand to create the story, we're really just left with an image of an apple that could be very ambiguous. It could just be an apple that's had a bite taken out of it. So what we're doing with our image making here is much more than just making a visual representation. We're actually making meaning. We're telling stories, creating narratives, and giving extra information to the viewer. So let's look at another example. Here's our apple, but now it has a snake next to it. Now, what does that mean? How do we read this image? Reading denotation is quite easy. The apple's an apple. That's the only reading that we're trying to get as an image maker. But now with connotation, we're trying to suggest something or tell a secondary story, and that's a little bit harder. We're trying to actually control the meaning that we're conveying to an audience member, and that's a key design skill. So here you can see there's an image of a snake, and suddenly this becomes about sin or temptation. It has a biblical reference in the Western world. Now, denotative images can be very culturally contextual. They can mean different things to different cultures. In general, we're trying to work with an idea of cultural consensus here, that most people might understand what this image means. But sometimes that does involve a certain culture knowing a certain history or a certain context. So things can be different in different parts of the world. So with this image, for instance, it relies on the audience knowing the story of William Tell, of the archer placing an apple on his son's head and shooting it with a bow and arrow. Otherwise this image might just seem very strange, somebody with an apple on their head with an arrow through it. But if you know the context, then you really understand what the connotation of this image is. Let's take a look at some other ways that connotation can work. Here, for instance, we've got a maggot coming out of an apple. But it's almost antithetical to the way that the apple is drawn. It looks very happy, and even the maggot itself looks to be smiling. So here it's really interesting that the connotation, the suggestion that the apple is rotten, can actually be in direct contradiction to the denotative form, which is suggesting a happy apple, a healthy apple. In this image we've added some lines, and we've tilted the angle of the apple to make it look as though the apple is falling. Now this might just represent an apple falling from a tree, and that could still be a fairly denotative image. But in terms of connotation, it might also suggest a reference to Sir Isaac Newton and the apple falling from the tree that made him think of the theory of gravity. Or this image where the snake is made out of apples might actually again suggest sin. But on the other hand, we can see here a level of ambiguity. Perhaps that's not a snake at all. Perhaps it's just a hungry caterpillar. So again, the references can really be up to the reader, so sometimes there can be a level of ambiguity in connotation, and not everybody is always going to read the same image in the same way. So part of your job as a designer is to try and control the messages that you're making, and to try and think about how they're going to be read by an audience. So here, for instance, with this apple that has a letter grade next to it, that might suggest grading or teaching or a classroom, so the phrase that might come to mind could be an apple for teacher. Now that might rely on somebody knowing that phrase or understanding that phrase, But there are other images where the connotation can be universal. For instance, it's quite hard to look at this image and not think of the tech giant. You don't think of a real apple at all. You don't think of the fruit. You think of the tech company. Controlling connotation is really about controlling meaning. And again, obviously that's very important for designers in terms of how they communicate to their audience. So for this image, for example, if you understand or know a little bit about art history or about Magritte's paintings, it's very hard to look at this and not think about that Magritte painting, and not understand that it's a reference to surrealism. Even though it's not an exact copy of the painting, it contains the same elements. So your brain is basically connecting those elements back to this other artwork, this other reference. So it becomes more than just, here's an apple wearing a bowler hat. It becomes, oh, here's a Magritte-esque surreal apple. So the way that connotation works is that it references something else. It signifies something else. And that thing that it signifies, it suggests, isn't always the same as what the thing is itself. The apple can suggest more than just an apple. And quite often connotation is tied to how we use language. So here, for instance, we can see image and text working together, and if we read this, we can read it as apple of my eye. But if we take away the text and put the apple where the pupil should be, we can still read that image as apple of my eye. We still think about that phrase, even though there's no language there to suggest that at all. And these connotations, these visual metaphors, they can almost be like a rebus or a puzzle sometimes, that they take a little unfathoming, they take a little work to understand. And this is because connotation is inherently more complex than denotation. It relies on other things. It relies on a cultural context, and it relies often on a body of knowledge of the viewer. So whereas denotation works for everybody, and connotation requires a level of visual literacy or a level of contextual understanding that makes it much more complex. It's actually asking a lot more of the viewer, but the upside to this is it gives the designer way more tools to create more complicated messages.
For many people, typography can be one of the hardest aspects of graphic design to understand, but it's also one of the most important. If you think about it, graphic design is really made up of communication in words and communication in pictures, and typography is half of that equation. It's how we communicate with words. For many people, type can feel like a foreign language. It almost seems like it's very obtuse, like you can't enter into it or see it or understand it in any way. So what we're going to try and do in this course is break down typography so you understand the terminology to do with it, and you understand a few basic ways to work with type. What we're really hoping the outcome of this course will be is that you'll feel comfortable with using type, and you'll be able to have a set of rules that let you know how to work with type, but it'll also hopefully free you up a little bit to start experimenting and playing with type a bit more.
In order to learn how to work with typography, you're first of all going to need to learn how to talk about typography. You're going to need to know some typographic terminology, or what you might call the lexicon of letters. That's going to give you a shared vocabulary with other designers, but it's also going to let you look at letter forms and typography and understand all their intricacies and how they work. So let's start out by looking at the simplest building block of typography, the single letter. So let's look at the letter A. Letter forms are constructed of strokes. So if we look at our letter A, for instance, here we can see that the letter form is constructed of 2 strokes. And this construction by stroke really goes back to when letter forms were drawn by a pen or a brush, so they would have individual strokes drawn by hand to make up the letter form. Letter forms have their own specific terminology to describe the various different parts of each letter. So here we can see some different parts of the letter form that make up the anatomy of the letter A. So here you can see the 2 strokes of our letter form. You can see the vertical stroke is called the stem, and this holds a lot of the weight and the stress of the letter form. And then the other part of the letter form, the other stroke, is called the bowl, where it's round and curved. The end of the letter form is called the terminal, and this area can be truncated, cut perpendicular or diagonally, or have a rounder, more ball shape. The space that's trapped inside a letter form is called the counter space, and this can be space that is entirely trapped or space that is partially trapped. Where the end of the letter form trails off is known as a spur, and obviously the ends of the letters can also be a place where serifs might exist. A lot of typographic terms are based on the human body, and that's partly because letter forms were drawn on humanist proportions, based either on proportions of the human figure or drawn showing evidence of the human hand. So let's look at some of those terms. Here, for instance, we can see a group of terms that relate to the human body, but also relate to letter forms. So here you can see the capital letter R has a shoulder, but it also has a leg that sticks out. And these elements are named this way because they look like these parts of the human body. The small appendage on the upper part of the G is called an ear. At the bottom of the leg of the K you can see it has a foot, and sticking up in the air above that you can see there's the arm. And here you can see the negative space, the counter space that's trapped inside the letter E is called the eye. And the diagonal holding a lot of the weight and the stress of the letter S is called the spine. Now we've looked at typographic terminology to do with letter forms, let's look at some of the terminology to do with words. Here's a word made up of single letter forms, and they look like they're floating in space on the page, but they're not really floating in space, they're aligned on an invisible line called a baseline. The baseline falls at the bottom of the capital letters, and it falls at the bottom of the main central part of the lowercase letters, and you can see where a letter form like an X, for instance, really delineates that height of the lowercase letters, and that in fact is called the X height. Most lowercase letters share a common X height, and there's other measurements that we look at as well. If you look at the height of a capital letter, that's called the cap height. Now some letter forms have pieces that go above and below the X height. When they go above the X height, they're called ascenders, and when they go below the X height, they're called descenders. Roman letter forms normally come in two different types. There's the capital letters, or uppercase, and then there's the lowercase. And the reason why these letter forms are called uppercase and lowercase is because in the old days of metal type, the metal type would be kept in a type drawer or a type case, and these cases would be stacked right next to the printing press, and the lowercase letters would be kept in a case that was down below, and the uppercase letters or capitals would be kept in a case that was up above. A lot of typography has to do with relationships of contrast between darks and lights, whether that's ink on a page or pixels on a screen. And as soon as you have relationships that rely on these negative and positive contrasts, you realize how important something like space is to typography, and there's various kinds of space in typography. So here you can see that the space between letters is called letter space, or sometimes that's referred to as kerning when you alter that space. The space between words is called a word space, and if you alter both the letter spacing and the word spacing, then that's called tracking. So let's take a quick look at how the letter spacing and word spacing affects both the look and feel of the type, but also the legibility. So let's change the tracking on these two words and see what happens. You can see if we make that very tight, then the words become very hard to read. They start to collide with each other. But on the other hand, if we increase the tracking and make the type very loose, you can see that there's a lot of space between the letter forms, and that's also going to make it seem very hard to read. You're going to start to see individual letter forms instead of reading words. One of the most important things you need to know about type is how type is measured, because type isn't measured in centimeters or inches, it has its own separate measuring system. So let's take a look at type size. Now we already know that type has a cap height measurement, and you'd think that might be a sensible way of measuring type, but that isn't how type is measured. The system for measuring type that we used is based on times when type was actually set on metal, and that metal was used on a printing press to print letter forms. So each letter form was a raised piece of type, and it had a body behind it, it had a solid piece of metal behind it. And that block of lead behind the type, that body, would have a uniform size so that the type could be lined up on a press in order to print it. And it's this body that we measure when we're measuring type, and that's known as the point size of the type. Now what is a point, you might ask, and that's a very good question. Basically there are 72 points in an inch, so a point is 1/72nd of an inch. And this might sound like a confusing system, but it's actually very useful because it can be mathematically divided into a very harmonious proportional system. So here we can see some different standard type sizes. 120, 96 point, 72 point, all the way down to 6 or 8 point type that's quite small. And these are a standard set of type sizes, and they came about again from metal typesetting. And in metal typesetting you would actually have to cast the typeface at a specific size. So right, you couldn't cast every single size, every single 1 point increment. You'd have to select which sizes you were going to set. So these harmonious mathematical relationships grew out of that. So it's very different from the computer screen where you can make type be any point size you like. So these basic standard sizes are really useful, especially when you're starting type. They can be a good guidelines or good starting points. So let's look at what some of these different sizes are used for. When you're first working with type, these numbers can seem quite abstract. They don't really make that much sense. So it can help to categorize them into certain usages. So the larger size type, 120, 96, 72, that would be something more like being used for headlines. The medium sized type would be for subheads, 36, 24, and if you were setting text, you'd set it in something like 10 point type, although I prefer 9 point or even 8.5, a little bit smaller. And then something as small as a 6 and 7 point type might be for footnotes or something like that. So let's take a look and see how that actually looks as comparative sizes in a format, say, for setting text in a book, for example. So here's some types set at these different sizes. You can see the headline is set at around 96 point, the subhead around 36, the body text is probably around 9 point, and the footnotes around 7 point. So you can see already how this kind of system, this scale harmonious system, works with these different preset point sizes. And it can really help you get a rough idea of what point size you should be using for what job. We've looked at typographic terminology to do with letters and to do with words, and now we're going to look and see what happens to that terminology when we look at a block of text. And it gets a little more complicated. There's a whole new set of terms that are introduced. When the text is set in a block like this to be read, it's called body text. And one of the first things to think about is how that text is going to be aligned. The two most commonly used settings for text are either justified or range left. So here let's look at range left, also known as rag right. When the text is range left, you can see on the left hand side it aligns evenly, whereas on the right hand side it's uneven or ragged. And when the text is justified text, you can see that it's even on both sides, both the left and the right, and this tends to form more of a square, solid shape, whereas range left tends to look a little more friendly, I think, and is a little bit easier to read. If you're setting range left text, you probably want to have 9 to 12 words in your line length, and this area across here, this is the line length, which is also known as the measure. And that's about 60 to 70 characters, which is a comfortable amount to read for anybody. It means they get to the end of the line and they can easily find their way back to the beginning of the next line. And justified text has a few more words per line, and it gives you a little more characters per line as well, probably around 70 or 80. So justified text can be a little more economical, but it can feel a little harsher on the page. Another aspect of typography that can dramatically affect how type looks and also its legibility is something called leading. So here's two pieces of typography. The type size is 9 point, the same, and the leading is 12 point, which is also the same. So what that 12 point refers to is the leading that the 9 point type is sitting on. And leading is basically the space that exists in the lines of type from baseline to baseline. So if you imagine these baselines being visible, you could measure that space, and it wouldn't necessarily be the same measurement as the type size. So let's see what happens when we change the leading. So here's two samples of type, the same type size but set with different leading, and you can see straight away how different they look. They're both 9 point type, but the one on the right is much easier to read. So here you can see the type is 9 point on 9 point, so that's very tight. There's very little space between each line of type, and that's called being set solid when the type size and the leading are the same. But with the 9 on 16 you can see there's much more space between the lines, they're clearly visible, and this might be too much leading. And the way that you can tell if your leading is too much or too little is really just to think about the comfort of reading. When you get to the end of a line, how easy is it for you to travel back to the beginning of the next line? Do you lose your way, or is your eye taken there quite easily? On the left the lines are too tight together, so that might be confusing, but on the right they might be so loose that you can also lose your way. A handy trick to tell if your leading is approximately right on the computer is just to take your cursor and highlight the text. If you can see too much space between the black bars that are formed, then your type probably has too much leading, and if you can't see any space at all, your type probably needs a little bit more leading. We've looked at point sizes and how that's measured from type sitting on a body, but let's look at how different typefaces can appear to be visually different even though they're the same type size. So here's 3 different typefaces, and these would all be the same size, they'd all be on the same body, they might all be 72 point for instance, but they certainly don't appear to visually be the same size. So even though all 3 typefaces are on the same body, you can see the typeface in the middle is visually much larger. It has a much larger X height, it has shorter ascenders and descenders, so it's taking up more space within the body. And this is worth thinking about because when you set type, it isn't just the point size that's going to affect how the type visually appears, it's also the typeface that you choose. When you first start to work with type, one of the things that can be the most daunting is choosing a typeface. There's so many typefaces out there, it can be quite overwhelming. How do you know which one to choose? How do you know the good ones from the bad ones? Or how do you know which one might be right for a certain job? And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at how do you choose a typeface. Let's start by clarifying just what a typeface is. We all think we know what a typeface is. It's that thing that we recognize the shape of when we see it. We see these shapes and we think, oh, that's very familiar. We know that typeface. It's Times New Roman. For most typefaces, you'd use the regular or Roman version. This means that the strokes are straight and non-italic, and it's an average weight, not too heavy and not too light. Each typeface is normally part of a larger type family. A simple family is made up of the regular or Roman, a bolder version, an italic version for emphasis, and a bold italic version, and this makes up a simple type family. One thing that often causes a little confusion is the difference between a typeface and a font. Often in computer programs, the typeface is described as a font, but the 2 terms actually aren't synonymous. So let's take a look at the difference between a font and a typeface. A typeface is what we've already looked at. So that's one style within a type family. So here we can see Times Italic is a typeface, Times Roman is a typeface, Times Bold is a typeface. And it doesn't matter what size you set that typeface in, it's still going to be the same typeface, Times Roman. When used correctly, the term font actually applies to both the typeface and the size that it's set in. So for instance, 72 point Times Roman would be a totally different font than 36 point Times Roman, even though they would be the same typeface. And this terminology is from the days of metal type, when type would be cast on a certain size body, and the type would actually be redrawn depending on the size that it was going to be reproduced at. So actually 72 point Times Roman would look slightly different from 36 point Times Roman, and so it would be a different font because the letter forms would be adjusted to print at a certain size. And that's no longer the case with digital typography, where everything is scaled up and scaled down very evenly. So we really now have changed the way that we use the term font, and the 2 become relatively interchangeable. But if you ever get stuck or get confused, it's always safer just to say typeface. When choosing a typeface, it can help you to start out by asking yourself some of the larger typographic questions. Should I use a serif or a sans serif? And what's the difference between the 2 anyway? Well, we can take a look at that right now. Serifs, basically, at the end of their strokes, they have areas that stick out beyond the end of the stroke, and these were often originally came from chisel marks where letters were carved into stone, but they also became decorative and exist in many different forms. One of the functions of the serif is to actually accentuate the baseline, and this sometimes helps the letters be easier to read in long texts. In contrast, sans serifs have no serifs at all. You can see that the strokes are actually truncated at their terminals. They're cut off flat. This gives a very clean, modern look, and while we've been trained to read serifs perhaps a little bit easier than sans serifs, we're so accustomed to it now that you can really read both of them with the same speed and legibility. So one of the deciding factors is often just how the type looks and feels. A serif obviously feels a little bit more old-fashioned, a little bit more classical, whereas a sans serif can feel more modern and cleaner, more geometric as well. So we've broken down the categories into serif and sans serif, 2 major categories, but let's break them down a little bit further and see what happens after that. Let's start by looking at how the serif typefaces break down. Serif typefaces can be broken down into 4 main categories. Let's look at them chronologically. old style, transitional, modern, and Egyptian. As you can see, they look quite different. The letter forms have different characteristics. So let's start to look at those more closely. Let's start with old style. Old style serifs have a limited contrast between the thick and the thin strokes. They appear quite heavy and quite chunky. So if you look at the letter forms, the thick strokes are really not that different from the thin strokes. They also have a diagonal stress between the thick areas and where the thinner areas are. A typeface like Plantin that you can see here would be a good example of an old style typeface. Transitional typefaces come a little bit later, and you can see that they look a little bit different. They have slightly more contrast between the thicks and the thins. The thins look a lot thinner than Plantin, so the type feels a little bit lighter, a little more airy and delicate. They have a slightly less diagonal stress and slightly more vertical stress, so they start to look a little bit more contemporary. Modern serifs really aren't that modern at all. They date from the late 1700s and early 1800s, and you can see they're quite a radical departure in letter forms from previous serifs. If you look closely, you can see that they have a much straighter serif. There's very little angle to it, but also it's very, very thin. It's almost a hairline serif. You can see there's a lot of contrast between the thick parts of the letter forms and the thin parts of the letter forms. In terms of stress, they're pretty much symmetrical. The last category of serifs that we're going to look at are Egyptians. Egyptians have virtually no contrast between the thick and the thin strokes of the letter form, but also no contrast in weight between the strokes and the serifs. This makes them very, very sturdy and very even. They're also often symmetrical, so there's no stress to the letter form, and they're really a precursor to modern sans serif types. We can break sans serif typefaces down into three major categories. Let's look at them chronologically: grotesque, geometric, and humanist. If we look at grotesque letter forms, these are quite simple letter forms. They're built out of slightly irregular forms with an even stroke. And what this means is the typeface looks very clean and modern like a sans serif, but it still has a little bit of the funkiness and unevenness that we've seen in serif typefaces. Geometric sans serifs are much cleaner and more modern looking than grotesques. You can see here with Futura, with its round O and its geometric letter forms, how clean and modern it looks. The letter forms are built from modular systems, and this leads to repetition and evenness in the forms, but there's also a sense of no decoration to the letter form, so they'll have a very clean and modern feeling. That minimal feeling of the geometric sans serif is somewhat in contrast to the humanist sans, and the humanist sans really feels like it's bringing back some of the characteristics of the serif, and that the term humanist comes from showing signs of handwriting or a human being in the construction of the letter form. In this case, that quite often refers to either handwriting or pen strokes, so there's a reintroduction of the idea of thicks and thins in the letter forms, but also a little more character and a few more flourishes, and this often lends humanist forms to be a little less cold and a little warmer as a sans serif. The uncluttered and modular nature of sans serif letter forms often lends themselves to having a much more extended family than we've seen with the serif typefaces we were looking at, and this often expresses itself through weight and width. So if we look at an extended family, like Universe for instance, we can see that you as the typographer suddenly have even more choices to make. You've got a range in weight and a range in widths that go from ultra black at one end of the scale all the way through to light at the other end of the scale, or from condensed to extended as well. And this gives you a really wide range of typefaces even within this one family, yet they're all Universe. So as a typographer, you're getting more and more choices about the kind of typeface that you're going to use, and this can be a little overwhelming, but perhaps a better way to look at it is if all these different typefaces and different weights, they're all just like toys, and the more toys you have, the more fun you can have with them. When we read words, but at the same time we're reading words, we're also reading typographic form. We're seeing letters and shapes, and these things communicate something to us as a viewer. So let's have a look at how that works. There's mainly two different things that are being communicated. There's on the one hand, there's a level of pragmatic functionality with the typography. Can we read it? And on the other hand, there's an expressive, connotative aspect to the typography. What does it make us feel like? Controlling both of these aspects of typography is what makes a good typographer. On the one hand, you control the pragmatic side of the type, which is really the nuts and bolts, getting things to work properly. If you like, that's the technical side. But on the other hand, you also control the expressive, emotional side, the connotation, the way that the type feels. So good typographers can deal with both of these things. Let's break them down, and let's start by looking at functionality or denotation. Let's work through an example so you can see how functionality and pragmatics affect type decisions and choices. Let's imagine, for instance, that we're going to design a piece of type for a museum. We're not really going to try and think about what kind of museum it is. We're really just going to try and think about the pragmatics of the typography. So if we looked at a serif and a sans serif, for instance, that would give us connotation. The serif might seem like a much more old-fashioned or traditional museum, whereas the sans serif might feel much more like a contemporary museum. And what we're really interested in is just the purely functional part of this. So let's choose the sans serif, because that's going to work at a lot of different sizes and be a little more neutral. So let's make some typographic decisions based on functional considerations. So if we were going to use this typeface, the sans serif for instance, we might want to start out by thinking about a typeface that has a wide family, a good range to it for a lot of different uses. So let's say we're going to use this typeface for everything in the museum, from the museum's name, to signage inside the museum, to catalogs and publications, to posters and banners. Pretty much everything the museum does, that's going to be part of its typographic identity. So we're probably going to need something with a wide range, so having an extended family is going to be really useful. So straight away, that's going to limit our type choices, or at least inform our type choices. So here I'm looking at Univers as my choice for the museum's typographic identity. And the next thing I probably wanted to look at in a pragmatic way is what the type looks like at different sizes, because we're going to use it at a lot of different sizes, and we're also going to use it on screen and in print. So let's look at that and see how it works. Let's see what the typeface looks like when it's very small and when it's very large. Is it going to work at every size? Is it going to have that kind of range and flexibility that I need? Those are pragmatic considerations. Once I've found some typefaces that have the range and functionality that I need, I can start to really narrow down my type decision and look in much more detail at the kind of typefaces that I'm going to choose. I can start to narrow them down and really examine them much more closely. So let's look at two typefaces that I might have chosen for this project. So both of these typefaces might have the range and functionality that I need, so how am I going to choose between the two of them? I'm actually going to have to just look a little bit closer. When you first look at them, these two typefaces don't look that different, but on close inspection, there is quite a lot of difference. Let's look at that. One of the first things you might notice is that these two typefaces, even though they're the same size, one appears to be a little larger than the other. And that's because you can see here they're sitting on the same baseline, but actually the X height is a little bit larger on this typeface than this typeface, but also the cap height is a little bit larger as well. The typeface on the right also seems to look a little bit heavier, a little bit darker, and the letterforms look a little bit more condensed or narrower as well. Let's look at why the reason for that might be. If we look really closely at the construction of the letterforms, we can see that the typeface on the left actually has way more thicks and thins. So you can see the parts of the letterform here are getting a lot thinner. There's a lot more differentiation in the line. The stroke in this typeface is much more even. And one thing that you can see a lot of difference in is actually the letter S here. If you look at the shape that the letter S makes, this feels very different. So it's really useful when you're trying to analyze a typeface like this to look very closely and see what the differences are between two typefaces. One thing that can help you see those differences is to take some of the letterforms, blow them up really large, and lay them one on top of the other. So now the typeface on the left has the black outline, and the typeface on the right has the red outline. Where the two areas overlap is this darker grey, and where the areas are different you can see the lighter grey. So you can see that some characters, they're actually quite similar. This E, very similar. You can see a little difference in weight, but really the end of the stroke here is where the big difference is. And then other letters like the M, you can see they have a lot of difference. The thickness and the evenness of the stroke is different, the width of the letter form is different, and even with this S you can see the stress we were talking about, how it's very different in here, and also the terminals are very different as well. Now these differences might seem very small, but the reason why we're looking at them is because when we actually set the type and look at type and read it in these typefaces, the difference is actually going to be quite large. So let's take a look at what these two typefaces actually look like when they're set. So here you can see how even those tiny differences, they make a big difference when you're actually looking at the type. So one typeface here appears to be much larger than the other. This typeface appears to have more leading than this typeface. All of these things are coming out and being visible just based on those tiny characteristics of the typeface, because these two pieces of type are set with the same type size and the same leading. So one of the reasons I'm making you look at all these things in great detail is to try and get you to really be analytical about typography, to really see all the differences and really understand how to control and use them. If denotative typography deals with the functional, pragmatic, analytical skills of typography, the technical skills if you like, then connotation really deals with the expressive, the emotive side of typography. And a lot of that comes out in how we read typographic form, how that makes us feel. We read in two different ways. We read what the word says, but we also read the shapes of the letter forms. We read the form of the letter forms. As an example, let's set the same word in two different typefaces. Here you can see the word fast in Cooper Black on the left and in Universe on the right. And the two look very different. One of them certainly looks much faster than the other. The typographic form of the Cooper, for instance, is heavy and blobby and has a lot of weight to it. It's very static, so it's antithetical to what it says. It seems like it's the opposite of fast. Whereas the Universe on the right feels sleek and light. It's got a lot of movement to it as well, so it feels like it's reiterating what the word actually says. It feels fast. If we delete the letter S, then suddenly we read the typographic form in a whole different context, because the word says something different. Suddenly the Cooper Black looks very, very appropriate. Its heaviness, its blobbiness, its weightiness, those all feel appropriate for what the word says, whereas the Universe on the right suddenly feels the one that's antithetical to what the word says. So controlling this kind of connotation and thinking about the relationship between what words say and what their typographic form is really, really important for designers, because it's a way that they can create messages and control those messages for an audience. So let's look at how typographic connotation can work in a little bit more of a subtle way. Imagine that we're trying to design for a painter who's having an exhibition. His name's John Painterman. Here we can see his name in Baskerville, and he feels like a fairly traditional kind of painter, a kind of a classical painter. All the information that we're getting about John, apart from his name, is coming from the typographic form. We could make John feel even more like a painter by maybe setting his name in a brushstroke typeface. By setting his name in this kind of typeface, we get an idea that perhaps John is a traditional painter that paints with a brush. But if we read this form, it also feels like maybe it's a little bit too old-fashioned, or maybe John's a calligrapher instead of a painter. Maybe we could think of a typeface that's a little bit more classy, a little more upmarket. Maybe John paints landscapes, and maybe we want to make some reference to that in the typographic form of his name. Although now he feels like he's probably a gardener rather than a painter. Or maybe John is a more modern painter. Maybe he'd like to be represented by a typeface that's much more cleaner, much more neutral and contemporary. Maybe his paintings are a little bit more lighter, a little more airy. Maybe a lighter typeface would be a better way to represent John and his paintings. Or perhaps John is more of an abstract painter, and he uses a lot of geometry in his work, and somehow these typographic forms would be better for him. All of these pieces of typography say the same thing, John Painterman, but they all look very different. They all give us different kinds of additional information. The connotation of the typographic form is the thing that's different. They tell us something about John's character, or maybe something about what kind of painter he is, but either way, we read both the words and we read the form of the words as well. And as a designer, the more that you can be in control of those words and the form of those words, the better communication you can have, and the more you can control that communication. Typographic connotation relies on the fact that we read words, but we also read form. So we've seen how connotation works with typographic form, but let's look at some other typographic moves we can make that also affect connotation. Here on the screen is what we've already seen. Here's the word architecture, and we would read this in three different ways, or think about three different kinds of architecture, purely due to the typeface choice. In the first one, we might look at it and think about a more classical, balanced, even architecture. The second one, we might look at it and think about a certain time period where the typeface was used a lot, like the 1970s, and think about it as being heavy and blobby kind of architecture. And here in the bottom one, we might think about it as being modular, structural, and if we knew about typefaces, we might even know that this was from a certain time period in a certain place, and that might inform our reading of the form as well. So let's take away the heavily connotative typefaces, and let's replace them with some much more neutral kind of typefaces. So here we've got a set of quite plain sans serifs. I've made them look different just for the sake of this exercise, but we suddenly know a lot less about the architecture. Maybe we can tell a little bit about the weight, about how condensed it is, and maybe whether it's uppercase or lowercase. In this case, the all caps might make us think of a certain kind of maybe stronger architecture than just the lowercase would. But in all, we've actually removed information by removing the typographic form. On the other hand, you could argue that what we've gained by removing the typographic form is to remove the vernacular and to have a clean, modern, easier to read kind of typography. So if the typeface itself isn't going to do the work of communicating specificity, then maybe something else has to do it. We have plenty of other tools as designers. We don't just need to make all our voice heard through the typeface. We can use scale and composition, and these things can have an effect to how we read the typography in a similar way to how we'd used the typeface before. For instance, here just changing the uppercase T's and leaving the rest of the word lowercase might suggest an idea of shelter within the architecture. Here a simple shift in scale might actually introduce the idea of building in the architecture, and the same with stacking the letter forms here might suggest a certain kind of architecture or a certain kind of solidity to the architecture. As a designer, you have to be careful how you use connotation. Sometimes you can use it so that it says the wrong thing and actually starts to mean something you don't want it to. Here, for instance, we can look where just changing the letter spacing to tighten up the letter forms here might create a kind of architecture that feels uneven and crashing and uncomfortable and maybe doesn't feel safe. Here it might even look as if the architecture is falling over, and we might not want to have that as part of our design. Let's do what we did at the start of this demonstration, keep the same typefaces and change the words. That lets us really see how the typographic communication is working because the context we read it in has changed. So instead of architecture, let's look at tank tops, cupcakes, and power tools. Our tank top looks pretty classy. Our cupcake, that looks pretty fluffy and delicious. And our power tools, well, they look pretty solid and functional. If we remove some of the typographic connotation, then our tank top, well, it still looks pretty good. It looks modern and clean and functional. Our cupcakes, we maybe have a little less idea about how they're going to taste. And our power tools, well, they still feel pretty solid in that typeface and that block. The same typographic moves that seem to work for architecture don't seem to work so well for these subjects. Our tank tops, they look pretty much the same. Our cupcakes, I'm not really sure what they're doing or why they're growing like that. But our power tools, well, they still feel pretty solid. If we continue with the last round of typographic moves, well, our tank tops, now they feel like they might not fit too well. Maybe we're not so interested in those. Our cupcakes, well, now they feel a little bit like they look like the top of a cupcake, so that feels like it's a move that might actually work for this kind of content, this word. And our power tools, well, they still feel pretty solid and pretty useful. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is how much power typography has in relationship to words. It can really change the meaning of the words, the context of them, the connotation of them, and that's something that designers can really use as an asset. If you can control that typographic communication, you can really control the message that you want to give to your audience. We've looked at some of the terminology used with typography, and we've looked at how to choose a typeface, and a little bit about how typographic form communicates. So now we're going to try and put all of that knowledge together and try and build a piece of design using just typography. I'm going to walk you through the process of how to design a typographic monogram for yourself, and then how to use that as part of the design of a business card. This will give you some kind of context for the typography. It'll give you a chance to take all the knowledge that you have and apply it to a piece of design. I'm also hoping that by showing you and going through this with you, it'll give you an idea of process and methodology of how to use type as well. So let's take a look at our format. We're going to work with a standard American-sized business card, which is 3.5 inches by 2 inches. And that can be horizontal or vertical. So first of all, let's make a list of contents so we know what's actually going to be on our business card. We're going to have our name, email, phone, and a monogram that we're going to make. So let's start out by working on the monogram. And what that is it's a design that's going to be based out of your initials from your first and last name. So I'm going to use an M and a W because those are the initials of my first and last name. So the first thing that I might do is start to look at a variety of different typefaces and look at those specific letters in a range of typefaces, partly because it'll help me see a lot of different shapes, a lot of different M's and a lot of different W's. So when I start doing this, I really have no idea how I'm going to use the M's and the W's. I don't know how they're going to fit together into a monogram, but what I do know is that I maybe want to have some interesting forms. So I'm starting to look and see what the range of forms are. So you can see that here we've got a straight M, a flared M, we've got an italic M with a loop in the middle. There's a nice foot to this italic M. I'm looking at serifs, I'm looking at sans serifs. So I'm getting an idea of the kind of range of letters that might be interesting for me to work with. And in terms of process, this is something that you can look at quite quickly. You can really just set a lot of different letter forms and just look at them and analyze them, and it's a way of forcing yourself to really look at the different shapes and give yourself a range of starting points. So here's a bunch more M's and W's. You can see some are made out of solid shapes using negative and positive. Again, there's a nice cross in the middle of the W here. There's rounded forms, again straight forms, flared forms, more traditional serifs down here. But they're all different, and I have no idea what I'm going to do yet. I'm just really seeing, well, what's out there? What are all the different letters that have possibilities? And they're all readable as M's and W's. Every letter has a variety of ways that it can be written and still be recognizable. So I could keep going and look at even more. Here are some letter forms that we've seen in some of the earlier lessons. So I'd really go for a range here of things that are traditional from different time periods, things that are perhaps a little more quirky and a little more unusual. But sometimes you can take a very normal letter form, and when you look at it up close, you can start to see that there are some strange and interesting things happening in the form. And you can choose which typefaces you're going to set your letters in for any number of reasons. They can really be just personal preference, things that you like. It can be absolutely subjective, things that you think have interesting forms, and none of them might work out. But what's important in this as well is you're getting to know a range of typefaces, and you're getting to really look closely at a range of letters. So in a way, you're educating yourself about typography and about typeface choice by going through an exercise like this. You're forcing yourself to really get to know your own library of type. So now I've got all these different kinds of letter form to work with. I'm going to spend some time to play around with them and just experiment and see what comes out of combining the M's and the W's together with each typeface in a variety of ways, and then we'll look at some of those results. I'm going to start by going back to the first typeface that I set the M and the W in, which is Univers Bold. And these are fairly regular sans serif forms, and I'm just going to play around with how the two letters fit together, see what kind of ideas I might come up with. So straight away, one of the things I notice is that the M is straight and the W is flared or angled. And I also am fortunate that my name has an M and a W, which are almost symmetrical letter forms. So to begin with, I start to wonder, well, what would happen if I turned the M into a W, for instance, and if I turned the W into an M? And just by a simple move like that, it means that I've suddenly got two letter forms that might interlock in a more easy way. So you can see the M and the W form a fairly harmonious pattern together, and the same with the straight M and the W. And even little accidents like that, when you're moving things around, you can see negative and positive space. You might start to think about how things might line up and what the relationship between the two letter forms might be. So let's just take this one and put it in another spot. So just starting to think about how the letter forms link together and what their relationship is, how they might overlap, sit side by side, and just starting to play around with what those letter forms are and how they sit together. And don't worry about legibility or trying to get any meaning into the letter forms and their arrangement. For now, just experiment and have fun, move things around, really look at the forms. It's kind of just a way of really playing and discovering, really, by moving form around. So rather than have you watch me shuffling around an M and a W, I'm going to go away, make some M's and W's with the typefaces that I chose, and then we'll look at them really quickly, just to give you an idea of, again, process, which is, in this case, just one of iterations and generation, trying to make a lot of work and a lot of possibilities, knowing that they won't all be good, but at least we'll have something to look at and react to. So here's some M's and W's working together, and I'm going to go through them quickly and just point out some of the strategies that are used for making these two letter forms work together. So here you can see we've flipped the W to make an M, so now we've got this nice repetitious harmony in the angle of the strokes and evenness in negative and positive space. That feels quite interesting. Here you can see if we just add a little tiny bit of space in between the two letter forms, it actually makes it a whole lot legible as an M and a W. Here we're just playing around with scale, taking one of the letter forms, making it smaller, seeing how it might fit into the counter space of the other letter form. Here, trying to do the same thing, but have them interact and overlap a little bit more. Down here you can see a similar idea to the strokes of the M and the W here in the rhythm and repetition, but with totally different and more solid letter forms. It starts to be a little harder to read. And here you can see trying to line up the serifs as a strategy for making the letters work together. And in this case, rather than trying to make the two letter forms be harmonious in terms of being straight or flared, here I'm trying to make the two work together and accentuate the difference between the two. My strategy for making these monograms would be to generate as many as possible as quickly as possible, just so I can try and see what the range of ideas are that are out there. So here's a bunch more that we'll look at very quickly. So you can see here different letter forms start to make different shapes. This one, the negative space, becomes interesting, almost looks like an intestine. Here you can see again the flipped letter forms, but with a totally different kind of letter, with a modern serif. It has a very different feeling. Here you can see what happens when we use here it's the straight capitals, here it's the angled capitals. It starts to feel very different. I kind of like this very blobby Cooper Black typeface, even though it isn't. I'm not sure what it's really doing. Just the forms and again the negative and positive space seem to be very interesting. So let's keep going and look at some more. Here you can see a more traditional italic typeface and how those might connect together. A much less conventional but still really interesting typeface. Some very simple forms, and really looking at how the two letters might align and start to make a new form. You see this very strange X appearing here. Trapping the negative space to try and make that have some kind of energy or become something else. And generally just really playing around with a lot of different things and just trying to generate ideas, and sometimes they really don't work, and that's fine. It's really just about volume and having fun. So now we have a group of monograms that we can work with. Let's put them into the context or the form of the business card and add the other typographic elements that we have and start to see how the two are going to interact. So here we are back at our business card, waiting to have the information added to it. So let's put in our name, email address, phone number. I'm going to use a fake phone number for this. And first of all, I'd set it in a fairly regular typeface, just so I can have an idea what kind of shape the type makes, ascenders, descenders, just looking at the kind of texture and the kind of color of the typography. So I might try setting it in a number of different typefaces first of all, and because this is the readable, legible part of the typography, I'd probably want to keep this fairly simple to begin with. So the first thing to think about here is just typeface choice for the information that's going on your card. And you can break it down to the decisions that we've already looked at. So you could start out with looking whether you want a serif or a sans serif, whether it should be heavy or light, whether it's all caps or upper and lower case. But generally just find something that you like the look and feel of. And you can always try a couple of different typefaces. So let's try some of these out and put them in the context of the business card so we can get an idea what they're really going to look like. So first of all, let's look at our alignment. We can have the type centered, we can have it ranged right, or we can have it ranged left. And then you can think about what position it occupies in the card. So depending whereabouts you put it, is it in the corner, is it up at the top, it can feel very different. Here where it's centered with a lot of space around it, it feels very even and balanced, and this has a little more tension here between the negative space up here and the positive element. You can think about the scale of your typography within the card. Should it be very small? Should it be really large and dominant? And you can play around with it, see which typefaces work at which different scales. And you can also look at the angle of your typography. We're used to seeing type being horizontal, but it can also run vertically, it can run at an angle, or your card itself might be a vertical or a horizontal card. If you now introduce your monogram into the design, you also have the same choices for the monogram. You can think about its position, its scale, and its angle. But one of the more complex things you're going to have to think about is how the elements interact together. How is your monogram going to interact with your other pieces of typography? We'll look at composition in more detail in another lesson, but let's take a very brief look at it just for the sake of making these cards. You could think about having a very active composition, one where there's a lot of contrast in scales, and where perhaps the type is divided up into separate elements that also have different scale. And you can have a great deal of contrast between the size of the largest element and the size of the smallest element. You could also think really carefully about how your type interacts with the logo type. Here you can see it's breaking the negative space of the monogram. Here it's overlapping, and here it's sitting quite respectfully around it. Or for a business card, you might want to have more of a static composition, but still have some scale weight and some contrast between your monogram and the typography underneath. So here you can see they're all centered. There's a lot of even white space around them, and you can there's a clear hierarchy between the monogram and the secondary typography. Or if you wanted to go in a less conventional direction, you could think about having a much more extreme scale contrast. So here you can see the monogram has actually been blown up to the full size of the card, and the secondary typography is interacting with it and mimicking the lines that the letter forms are creating. Perhaps the most important thing to think about and to remember is just to experiment and to enjoy yourself. Pushing type around and playing with it, getting to really know it, that's the best way to learn typography.
This week we're going to look at shape and colour in graphic design. We've already looked at images and how they work, and now we're going to look at objects and colour, but not as tools to make images of things, but more in terms of abstract graphic form. To start, we'll be looking at how abstract shapes communicate through their form, and how they can be used to create marks, icons, and symbols. Not surprisingly, graphic shapes are all around us, most noticeably as logos and icons, but also as major or secondary elements in almost every piece of on-screen or printed design. Quite simply, shapes are everywhere. Whether they're active or passive, communicative or neutral, they form an invisible backbone to most of graphic design. This might seem like a very basic area to investigate, but once again, it's a core skill in learning how to design. Working with basic shapes and colour is at the heart of identity and logo design, and it's surprising how frequently you're going to return to these fundamental skills. We'll start by just looking at black and white objects, simple shapes that can help with contrast, add visual interest, or they can be a unifying element as part of a larger system. And we'll be examining both simple and complex forms, and we'll be seeing how negative and positive space works, how figure-ground relationships are created. Then we'll look at the basic principles and attributes of colour, and examine how a designer can control and direct the colour and the mood of their work. Finally, we'll examine repetition, rhythm, and pattern, where you can apply your knowledge about shape and colour.
In this segment, we're going to look at graphic shapes, how designers use shapes and form. And simple shapes can be used by designers to help with contrast, to add visual interest. They can be an element that sits alongside typography or imagery, and they can really be a unifying element that works together in a larger system. So we're going to start out by really looking at these three basic shapes, and these three shapes typify the kind of directional qualities that other shapes might have. So you can see the circle is represented as the shape is circular, the triangle, the direction of it is more diagonal, and the square, the direction of it is horizontal and vertical. And you can see those directional qualities even more if we convert the shapes to lines. And basically that's what makes a shape. It's a space that's described by a closed path. So here you can see when we make the path open, you can see that the circle is actually just a line that would be completed. The triangle is made out of 3 strokes, the square is made out of 4 strokes. But as soon as we close those paths and perhaps add a color to the volume of the shape, we really stop seeing line and we really just see shape and form. And even though we're dealing with abstract form here, we always try and read something into that form. We try and make things that we recognize even out of abstract forms. So here you can see, just by changing the baseline of those objects, we might start to see this as a face. If we change the shape of the forms, then we really begin to see it as a face. So you can see how we're desperately trying to read these abstract forms as things that we recognize in the real world. And for part of this exercise, we're really going to try and just keep them as abstract forms and not try and make pictures out of them. But just quickly to illustrate our desperation to try and read into these images, you can see how small moves can make a lot of difference. So here's a happy face, a sad face. You move the shape up, it perhaps becomes a moustache. You put some circles in there and suddenly it's a pig or a bird. So you can see how just changing, back to a face again, you can see how just changing some basic shapes, there's a lot of power in shapes, whether they're used to represent something that's abstract, whether it's something in the real world, or in this case, whether it's a learned symbol. There's a lot of power in shapes, and designers use shapes in a lot of different ways. Some of the ideas that we're going to look at concerning shape and form and color are based on the principles from Johannes Itten, who was a teacher at the Bauhaus in the early 1920s. And he developed a basic course or a foundation there that looked at shape and form and color and composition in a way that hadn't really been done before. It was a very modern way of looking at these ideas. And he did it in a way that these basic principles applied to fine art and to industrial design, to graphic design, to a lot of different practices. And these ideas from the Bauhaus about shape, form, color, and composition, even though they're nearly 100 years old now, they're still really the foundation of contemporary design practice and contemporary design thinking. The basis for the Bauhaus foundation was really to understand and to control visual contrast. Now, this can mean a lot of different things, and visual contrast can work in many different ways, so we're going to try and break this apart first of all and examine the different kinds of visual contrast that can work with shapes. So the simplest visual contrast might just be the shape itself. So you could have a simple form, such as this circle, made out of a single line, or you could have a much more complex form, where it's non-geometric and made up of a much more non-symmetrical shape. You could think about a contrast in scale between an object being large or an object being small. Another primary contrast would be how the object feels in space, whether it's essentially a horizontal object or a vertical object. So here you can see two rectangles, one feeling very low and horizontal, and the other high and vertical. Similarly, you could also look at a much flatter shape and think about it being narrow or broad or wide. It's the same height, it's just actually wider. Now these might seem like very, very basic ideas or very basic contrasts between shapes, but I think sometimes they're things that we take for granted, so much so that sometimes we just forget about them and don't even think about them or experiment with them. So now if we take those flat two-dimensional shapes and try and look at them or think about them as three-dimensional forms, we have another contrast to think about. We have their depth to think about. So here you can see one form very shallow, very little depth, the other form with much more depth. So there's another contrast to think about. As well as the physical or mathematical attributes to shapes that can form contrasts, there are also aspects to shapes that affect things like composition and how the viewer really sees the shape. So for instance here, the long skinny rectangle placed at a diagonal creates a sense of direction in the viewer's eye. You tend to follow through that shape, so you get a very strong diagonal movement when you look at it, versus a square where it perhaps is much more static. It's sitting on a solid horizon or baseline, and because it's a geometric concentric shape, it visually pulls you into the center of the square. So just in terms of how you visually view these two objects, you could describe one as being dynamic or moving, and the other as being static. And this is going to be very important later on when we look at composition. And there can also be contrasts between the same shape. So here we have two squares, but they appear totally different, one being dark and one being lighter. So just the color or the tonality of the square can have an effect, can create a visual contrast. So we could also look at the shape itself, one shape being very crisp and the square being very vector-based and feeling very computery, and the other feeling much more, say, pixel-based and softer. So even though it's the same shape, one becomes hard, one becomes soft. So another visual contrast that you could think about is to think about the relationship between things being light and things being heavy. And here we can see this is partly shown in the shapes themselves, that the circle feels a little bit lighter, but also because the square is filled in with a black color, it feels much heavier. Also because it's on the bottom of this composition, it feels heavier. And the circle, because it's got a fuzzy outline, it's containing a white shape, it definitely feels like it's a little bit lighter than the square. And I feel like I cheated a little bit here by putting the type on the light one at the top and the heavy one at the bottom to accentuate the weight and the direction of each. But basically these shapes, part of what's making them feel different is the difference between being a shape that's described by a line and a shape that's described by volume. And the volume, obviously, when it's a contrasting color, it's going to feel much heavier, much more solid basically than an object that's being described by a line. In this video, we're going to look at the difference between marks, icons, and symbols. And we've really been looking at marks so far. We've been looking at graphic shapes. So these are the kind of shapes that are quite familiar from the last video, where we've looked at circle, square, triangle, we've looked at solid forms, we've looked at linear forms. And these are the kind of marks that graphic designers use a lot as elements in their compositions and with their graphic form. And these can be geometric and straight, they can be much more abstract and loose and or organic even, but they're still graphic marks. And basically graphic marks are devoid of meaning, so they don't really hold any connotation, so all they hold is denotation. So they become the equivalent of denotative graphic form, if you like. So in other words, circle, square, triangle equals exactly circle, square, triangle. So when the viewer tries to read these forms, all they can read into them is just what the form is itself. Icons and symbols work in a slightly different way. Both icons and symbols represent other things. So an icon, you can see here, is generally a pictorial representation of something, whereas a symbol often represents something more abstract, an idea or a construct. So here you can see that they both have simplified form, and that's what they have in common, and that's why people sometimes get confused between the two. But basically, an icon is pictorial, it represents actual things, it's easy to read, whereas a symbol, non-pictorial, represents ideas or products, and it has to be learned. In other words, it's coded. You can't look at it and figure it out. You actually have to be told what it means, what it represents, in order to figure it out. So while both icons and symbols can be built from the kind of simplified graphic forms that we've been looking at, symbols are perhaps the most interesting to look at because they can have a pure abstract form because they're non-pictorial. They just represent an idea, and the representation of that idea can take an abstract form. So for instance, if we look at these four symbols and think about how they might be read, what their associated meaning might be, certainly within a US culture, they would read quite differently. They'd have quite different concepts attached to them, even though they're actually quite similar forms. So if we read from left to right, they would read as being about Christianity, the red cross perhaps representing a hospital, the green cross a pharmacy, and the black X representing something being wrong. What this demonstrates is that even with very simple forms and very rudimentary tools, the designer has an incredible control over the meaning of something, over the meaning of an image or a mark. So graphic elements can be really powerful, even in their simplest forms. In this video, we're going to take a quick look at what happens when we take our shapes and we put them into an environment. The shapes then have a relationship with that environment, and we call this a figure-ground relationship. And what this really means is an object and background relationship. So if we look here, we can see our three familiar shapes of the square, triangle, and circle. And the figure here are the shapes themselves, the square, the triangle, and the circle. And the ground, the background, is a white field. Let's see what happens if we invert that relationship and we make the figures be white and the ground be black. You can see that it has a very different feeling. Because we're looking at this on a computer screen and white light is shining through the screen, suddenly these shapes on the black background, they seem much more vibrant and bright, and optically even perhaps seem a little larger. These relationships start to become even more interesting as they get to be more complex. If we add some other black shapes here on top of the white shapes, what they appear to be now are holes in the other shapes, and sometimes these are going to push to the foreground, and sometimes they're going to recede to the background. In this case, the black shapes generally feel as if they are still the background. They are holes that have been cut out of the other shapes. But what starts to happen is that figure-ground relationship has become a little bit more complicated. An idea of depth is introduced. And instead of the character, the object, standing flatly against the background, suddenly there's a little bit more push and pull, and we're uncertain which of these objects is closest to us and which is furthest away. And we can make the issue more complicated by using scale. Objects that are larger are generally closer to us in our field of vision, and objects that are further away are generally smaller. So even though these elements might be flat because they're graphic forms, they all have the same qualities. We're actually starting to look at them and think about perspective. We look at the large circle, we perceive the large circle as being closer to us, whereas the smaller circle we perceive it as being further away. But we don't actually know that. All of these objects could just be different in scale and all sitting on the same plane. So what I'm doing here as the designer is creating the illusion of depth through the use of figure-ground relationships and through scale. How the viewer perceives depth in this simple figure-ground relationship can also be affected by some other elements. Here we can see our three simple objects of square, triangle and circle, but with different tonal values, which means that they have a different amount of contrast to the background, the black square having the most contrast, and because of that it appears to be the closest to us, whereas the other elements seem to be receding into the background because they're closer to that background tonally. And one of the reasons that the viewer perceives this kind of depth, these foreground-background relationships, is really because of how we see in the real world. Things that are up closer to us tend to be sharper, cleaner, with more denser colors, whereas things that are further away, they tend to be slightly lighter and fuzzier. And if we were to arrange these elements so that they were overlapping, then we'd get an even greater idea of depth. So the ability to create depth, to create some kind of push and pull between the figure and the ground, this really relies a lot on tonality. It relies a lot on contrast. So depending what the background is, and depending what color the object is or what tone the object is, that can really have a lot of effect on the amount of depth, the amount of contrast that we perceive as the viewer. So if we look at these examples on screen here, we can see that with the white background, clearly the black shape, the black solid shape, has the most contrast and stands out the most. Whereas as soon as we move to the black background, obviously then the white shape has the most contrast and stands out the most. What's interesting is to look at a 50%, a halfway tint of black as the background, and to think about how that might then affect our reading of black and our reading of white as objects on that ground. And again, because we're looking at this on a computer screen, the white is going to come through shining a little bit more brighter and a little bit more powerful. So this tends to have the most contrast, even though in terms of pure percentage value, the two are exactly the same distance from the background tone. And it's quite interesting to look at how those tonal figure-ground relationships interact with each other. So if we look at these four dots ranging from white to black with a 33 and a 66% tint in between, if we look at what happens particularly to the dark grey circle when we change the background, you can see that your perception of that grey circle is going to change. Here it seems much lighter because it has less contrast, and here it seems much darker because it has more contrast with the background. Similarly, if we look at the same circles but then put them on a black background, that dark grey circle is going to appear to be darker against the white background with more contrast and lighter against the black background with less contrast. As we looked at previously, scale can affect our perception of depth in a figure-ground relationship, but so can tonality as well. And here we can see what happens when we start to put the two of them together. Now suddenly the darkest dot or circle really does appear to be receding, to be much closer to the black background than the large white dot, which really feels like it's in the foreground. If we then overlap those circles to further increase this idea of depth, we begin to start to really feel like there's a three-dimensional space in front of us, and we're really tricking ourselves here because deep down we know that this is just a flat graphic form. It's really an illusion of depth that we're creating. And it's interesting to see what happens when we do something as simple as switch the order of the tonality in these shapes. So for instance here it really feels like the white shape is coming out towards us, where by switching them it really feels like the white shape is in the distance, it's our focal point, and it almost feels as if it's a hole through the black plane that we're looking at. So it really positions the viewer in a totally different way. So just that simple shift can have a big difference in how we feel about the figure-ground relationship. And if we then take that overlap and invert that and deliberately kind of destroy the illusion of depth that we've created, it suddenly becomes a much more confusing image. We're not quite sure what is coming towards us and what is receding and further away. So you can see how these simple moves can be used to both kind of reinforce these dimensional figure-ground relationships, the push and pull of objects, but they can also, if they go wrong, actually kind of confuse things and really not help you in your design. Here's an optical illusion that illustrates how our eyes trick us when we're trying to perceive tone. We really do perceive it contextually, one thing against another. If you look over at the letter A and then look over at the letter B, it appears that that grey strip is a different color. It appears to be darker over by letter A than it is over by letter B, but in fact it's exactly the same all the way through. In this video we're going to look at color and how designers use color. And this is a really tricky area to investigate, partly because color can be both objective and subjective. We tend to read color and use color in many different ways for many different things. Our primary response to color is an emotional response, and I think this comes from our reaction to nature. When we see blues and greens, they might make us think of the sky, the ocean, or even grass, but somehow those are relatively calming. Whereas if we see red, for instance, that might make us think of blood and danger, for instance. And these kind of colors have been also saturated into our culture. So for instance, a stop sign is in red to gain our attention, to play on that emotional response. But on top of that emotional response is a subjective response. And this is really the way that each individual thinks about color. Everybody has colors they like and don't like, certain hues that are their favorites and others that are their least favorites, and this is a subjective response to color. And ultimately, this response doesn't matter. It's the least important way you can respond to color. There's also a more scientific response, and this might be thought of much more as a strategic way to use color as a designer, really looking at which colors go with which other ones, maybe less about mood and more about specific contrasts and values. Perhaps it would be better to call it a technical response to color. And as soon as we bring any kind of form into the color that might represent something in the real world, even something as simple here as a horizon line, we start to connect how we read color and how we think of color to that real world. So for instance here, just the horizon line might make us connect the read of this to being green grass and a blue sky. So where does color come from, and how can we start thinking about color when there are so many colors to think about? Well, one easy way, one starting point, might be to look at white light, and when that shines through a prism, it divides up into the color spectrum. And we're all fairly familiar with this color spectrum as being the colors of the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. In the spectrum, these colors blend together and blur one into the other, so even though we think of them as being 7 colors, there are actually a lot more than that. Scientifically, the color is broken up due to difference in the wavelength of the color. So red has the longest wavelength at one end of the spectrum, and violet the shortest wavelength at the other end of the spectrum. And when we think about color, we're mostly thinking about hue. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue. These are actually hues, but color has 2 other important values to it. Hue is probably the most powerful and the most visible attribute of color. The second attribute of color is light to dark. In other words, its value. Now we can think of this as grayscale, like we're looking at here, and that's very easy to see. At one end of the scale is 100% of the color, black, and at the other end is 0%, white. But value obviously works with any single color. So here we can see a range of values of red, for instance, ranging from 100% of the red, the darkest color, to white over here with 0% of the red, the lightest color. And you can obviously take any color and look at it as a range of different values. Take any hue and look at it with the values of 100% to 0%. Saturation is the third attribute of color, and perhaps the hardest to grasp. The way that I find it the most easy to think about is that if the value and the hue were to stay exactly the same, and you were to just say change the saturation, you would see that color go from a very dull color, for instance over here where it's pretty much a gray with no color in there at all the way up to a much more saturated, pure color over here. And if you really want to see the effects of altering levels of hue and saturation and value, a good idea is maybe just to open up a file in a program like Photoshop where the settings, the colors can be changed to HSL or HSV values, and you can just pull the sliders around and really see what happens as you change each of those attributes of color. So far we've looked at the color spectrum, but now we're going to look at the color wheel. If you imagine that you took the color spectrum, which is basically going from left to right in a strip, if you took that and bent it around into a circle so that your red, the start of the color spectrum, matched up all the way around through the color spectrum, matched up at the end to the violet, the far end of the color spectrum, you'd have this as a color wheel instead of a single linear spectrum. In the color wheel, colors that sit next to each other are called analogous colors, and these are basically colors that, if they were in the true spectrum, they'd be gradations from one pure color to another color. But here we're dividing them up into more solids, just to limit the amount of information that we're looking at. And these analogous colors would be very similar to the colors that they're sitting next to. And none of this is very different from looking at the color spectrum as a strip. And what makes the color wheel more interesting is when you start to divide it up and rotate parts of the color wheel. So if you imagine you were to cut a central circular strip from the color wheel, and then you were to rotate that 180 degrees, you'd get something like this. So what we've done here is taken a segment of each piece of the color wheel and paired it up with its exact opposite. So if you look here, we've taken a segment of the red, rotated it 180 degrees, and now it's paired with the green down here, whereas the green has moved up 180 degrees and is paired here. And these pairings of opposite colors, it's quite confusing, but they're actually called complementary colors. And what that means is that these two colors combined effectively would almost cancel each other out. If you think about the colors being black and white, they would form together to make a neutral 50% gray, for instance. But these complementary colors, they can be really useful as a starting point for thinking about color palettes. And even a simple color wheel like this one that I just made quite quickly can be really useful in terms of just pairing up colors and being able to quite quickly look at how sets of colors would work together, which colors might go well with other ones, which might be contrasting, complementary. And even by just changing this, you can see here keeping the cools with the cooler colors, the warms with the warmer colors, versus what we were talking about earlier, which is having something like this, which is much more contrasting pairs of colors. Another thing that I like to do with color wheels is to just set them up so that they work as a series of tints with the same color. And again, part of what's useful about this is just being able to mix and match different tints to kind of, rotate them in this case, and to see which colors match up with which other ones, where things might start to be interesting and start to help you begin to think about color palettes that you might be able to use, or to pair 2 or 3 different colors together, thinking about how they might work, not just in terms of hue as we saw in the earlier color wheel, but also now in terms of value as well. And obviously there's plenty of programs on the computer that have color tools where you can really control and manipulate the color wheels and look at various different palettes and the creation of those palettes, and also import pre-existing palettes or palettes that have been made by other people for certain moods or for certain uses. But for me there's something still quite nice about really just playing with these really basic aspects of value and of hue, and just looking at the difference between them and building your own palettes rather than just kind of accepting what already exists. And if you have time, something that is also quite interesting to do is to make this color wheel by hand, not to make it on the computer as I did, but actually to paint it as a physical cardboard wheel. And you learn a lot about pigment and about paint just by purely mixing the paint and applying the paint, and it forces you to really look at color quite closely, and by looking at it closely, that's how you learn about it. As a graphic designer, you have to think about color in different contexts, and this can actually have quite a big effect on that color. And those contexts are mostly to do with looking at graphic design on screen or off screen. When you're looking at something on screen, the light is shining through a monitor, and that's very different from looking at something that's printed, for instance, where what you're actually seeing is the light bouncing back off the paper through the ink. So there are two very, very different color systems that are associated with this. When we look at something on screen, we're really looking at color made up of red, green, and blue, or RGB, and this is common to pretty much all devices, whether it's phone, television, computer screen. So if we make a Venn diagram of how red, green, and blue colors interact with each other, you can see that what happens is when you combine all three, you actually get white, which is very different from how pigments work. You can also see how, for instance, if you mix red and green, you'd get yellow. Again, very different from how pigments work. And this is because RGB is basically additive color. What this means is you're basically starting out from black and you're adding light colors, and when you've added 100% of everything, you would end up with white. And if you think about it, this makes sense because you're really working with an on-screen medium, so you're kind of painting with light, if you like. So you're starting out from black, and everything that you add has to be made out of light in order to be seen. If we now look at painted color or pigment, one of the first things that you'll notice is the difference between painted color and RGB on-screen color is that one of our primary colors is different. So instead of green, we've now got yellow as one of our primary colors. And if we look at a Venn diagram of how these three colors interact, you can see that they interact in a very, very different way. When you mix all of these three colors together, you get black instead of white. So here we have our primary colors of red, blue, and yellow, and you can see that where each single primary color overlaps with one other single primary color, it makes a secondary color. So red and yellow overlap to make orange, red and blue overlapping to make purple, blue and yellow overlapping to make green. And these kind of concepts of making secondary colors out of primaries are very familiar to most of us, just from being a child and mixing paint together and seeing what the effects of different pigments mixed together are. Printed color, also known as four-color process, works in a slightly different way than the two other systems that we've looked at, RGB and painted color. To begin with, we're working with four inks, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, which is also known as CMYK. CMYK is predominantly used as the way of mixing inks on a four-color offset press. So if you were doing a job as a designer and the work was actually being printed instead of being shown on the screen, for instance, you'd need to know how to deal with CMYK and how to get something printed that's going to really look like how you imagined or how you envisioned it or saw it on the screen. And CMYK ink works in the same way as pigment color does. In other words, it's a subtractive color. So you can see here when you add cyan and magenta together, you start to get a purple color, which is very similar to mixing blue and red that we saw when we were mixing pigments. When you mix all three colors together though, cyan, magenta, and yellow, what happens is you should really be able to obtain a black, but you can never really get a true dark rich black, and that's where that fourth color comes in. And you can see here that that fourth color, instead of being called B for black, is actually called K. And there's a couple of different hypotheses as to why that is. Normally it's the K stands for key, and black in offset printing is used to add detail and often used to print a line that holds all the other color work together, and that's sometimes called a key line. So that's one reason why it might be called K. And another reason, which I'd like to think is rather a myth, is that it's there to differentiate itself from the cyan plate, which could also be called blue. So if you had a B for blue and a B for black, it would be too confusing. When CMYK is used on a printing press, basically each one of those colors is a separate plate on the press, and each color is put onto those plates in terms of a very, very small dot. And when these dots overlap, in the same way that we can see the colors overlapping here, they can form other colors. So it gives you a full range of color out of just those 4 plates. And you can see this quite easily for yourself. If you actually look at a printed image, say a 4-color image, a full color image, like this photograph for instance, that's been printed, and if you zoom into it really close, you'll be able to see the dot pattern, and you'll be able to see how those different dots are overlapping with each other and how they're making other colors. So you can see here these very small areas, different colors, and there's some white in there, some black in there, yellow, but you can see there's very pure colors. So basically everything that you look at that's printed with a CMYK dot is kind of an optical illusion. Again, it's tricking your eyes into thinking that there's another color there, when in fact it's just dots that are overlapping. The last kind of color we're going to look at is spot color, and this is really a subset of CMYK, and spot colors are used in offset printing, and they're used when you need a very specific color that you maybe can't mix out of the CMYK color set. So sometimes this might be something like a bright orange, or perhaps a fluorescent color, or a metallic, and you'd use a special ink for this, the way you would mix that precise color of ink, and then you would run that as one of the plates on the CMYK offset press. In this segment we're going to look at how color and shapes can work together to form pattern. Pattern really relies on 2 things in order to work. It relies on rhythm and repetition, and the 2 are interrelated. So rhythm is often created by the repetition of a shape, creating negative and positive space, or as we've seen with colors, push and pull with different kind of contrasting colors. So even just by repeating the word rhythm here, you can see how some shapes create an enclosed negative space and feel very different than shapes that rely purely on repetition and interlocking forms. So the repeated H here begins to actually look like a ladder, like a continuous form, whereas the Y feels more like perhaps a pattern or a series of things connected together. So let's start out by taking a simple shape and playing around with it a little bit and seeing what we can do in terms of color and shape and pattern. So to begin with, instead of using a solid shape, let's maybe use the same shape. Let's take this hexagon and we'll use it as the outline, so that it's got an inside and an outside, so immediately we're having to think about 2 different colors, and we'll be able to get some push and pull between negative and positive space. So one thing we could think about is really just how this shape relates to itself. What kind of patterns can we make from looking at this shape? So if you think about just the shape overlapping, straight away here you create 2 chevrons and a diamond, so you've immediately started to form other shapes out of the original shape, and that's a really interesting part of pattern. So you could look at, depending just in the relationship between these 2 elements, you can begin to build some quite interesting, quite kind of fun relationships that can be the basis, the foundation for what your pattern might be. And as soon as you start to have even more elements than this, if you start to work with, let's say we start to work with 3 elements for instance, you can see here now we're building various other shapes, much more complexity. We've got different scales of shapes, we've got repetitions of diamonds, we've got self-contained shapes, more open shapes, and just, when you're starting to work with pattern and shape, a good idea is just to play around a little bit, and this can form the basis of building logos, identities, any of these things, as well as actually building proper usable pattern. But there's a lot of graphic elements that really rely on just playing around visually with forms and thinking about how they lock together and how they make other shapes, other patterns, other forms. So here we're really just working with a linear shape, so there's a limited amount of possibilities. So we could think about things like alignment that we looked at, we could think about repetition for instance, and how shapes might make other shapes. We could think about scale and how you might take the same shapes and maybe scale them down to make another part of a pattern or of an object, and we could also think about rotation as well, and think about how that might relate to building some kind of pattern or object. And if you're working on making patterns like this, I would just really think about it in a very loose way, a very playful way, because I think it can be a great way to actually learn about how to make pattern and how to make form just by doing it. Especially in an instance like this, where we're not really looking at anything that's particularly for a particular purpose, for a particular client, or anything like that. And all we're really doing is looking at how shapes fit together. And so we're looking visually and looking and learning by watching and doing. And that's really what graphic design is, and the best way to learn about graphic design. And that kind of playful approach also means that it's kind of low risk as well. So if we do something that we don't like, or we do something that that isn't successful, it doesn't really matter. We can just get rid of it and start all over again. So let's get rid of this one, and let's start by working on a very simple shape. So let's start with just this black square. So we're going to use this black square as the basic building block to build a pattern out of. So we're gradually going to make it more and more complex, but we're starting from a very, very simple form. And part of why I think this is a useful exercise to make pattern is that it helps you look at shape and color, but it also takes you through a process of going from simplicity to complexity. And we're not really going to worry about things being mathematically correct here. I'm just going to go through this and just kind of play and see what happens. So straight away, if I take the shape and repeat it and rotate it, you can see that we start to get another more interesting shape, but it's still got geometry, it's still symmetrical, both horizontally and vertically. So then if we take that exact same shape and put a scaled down version of it inside the black shape and make it white, we've suddenly got much more depth to our shape. Now we've got negative and positive space happening. So you can see here we've got a very flat form, and here we've suddenly got a little bit more depth. The white interior is coming towards us visually, and now the black shape is pushing back. But we've also got this other more visible, interesting shape here, and we see this much more as a line, a thick line now. So it gives us a lot more opportunities to work with as an element for our pattern. And if we do the same thing again, and we take this black shape, scale it down, put it inside the middle of it, you can see now we're starting to really get some depth to our shape, and we're starting to have a lot of possibilities for how we might deal with color in this shape, for instance. So I think these concentric shapes in alternating negative and positive colors seem to be working in quite an interesting way, creating some depth and some vibrancy. I'm going to see what happens if I take these away from being a square a little bit and make them appear a little more complex, a little less symmetrical just by rotating them. That seems a little more interesting to me. Then let's see what happens when we start to add a little bit of color to these shapes. So you can see how much the color has an effect on the white space. So here perhaps the black shapes might feel a little bit more visible, but as soon as we put these lighter colors in the background, we're partly separating out these shapes so that now they're two squares instead of one shape, but also this white is becoming much, much more of a dominant element in the design. So let's just take a look at that again very quickly. So now let's see what happens if we continue with that. We can push the center further back, and suddenly we've got a much less harsh feeling color palette, and this feels less like perhaps a mark that might be used for a company or something like that, and it feels a little bit more like it's becoming a pattern design that could be used as part of a repeating design. So if we then continue with this idea of, since we've got symmetrical elements, we can rotate them and try and make our composition a little bit more interesting. And then we could think about, well, now we've got an interesting element, let's group that element together and think about putting it into some kind of repetitive pattern. And you can see how these pieces, these building blocks fit together is going to start to make secondary shapes. So now we've got this very interesting dark brown lattice work happening. So I'm just going to repeat these shapes and basically make them take up the whole of the screen so we can get an idea how this feels as a complete pattern. So now we're viewing it as a pattern, you can really start to see some of the push and pull of the different elements. Some things coming forward, some things going backwards. And as we've created this pattern, we've actually created some new elements by forming the pattern. So not our original building block anymore, but the pieces that are made from putting our building blocks together. If you like, it's kind of like the cement or mortar between the bricks. So these are really interesting little chevron shapes that have been created that really I wasn't thinking about at all. They've just kind of appeared there. And we can maybe put those in a color, accentuate those, try and make them a bit more of a feature of the pattern. And now that we have a more locked-in pattern that we're going to work with, we can start to think about color a little bit more, I think. So let's see what happens if the black feels a little bit too dominant right now. We could see what happens if we separate this shape out. And I think you can see that here you really see the black shape quite clearly. And I think now you're obviously dividing it up into two shapes instead of reading it as one shape. So we can kind of keep going. We can fill in various different colors, and you can see how much not just the hue but the value of the color really has an effect on which things are going to be, which elements are coming towards you, which elements are receding into the background. So here you can see this feels very, very much flatter because there's similar tones, but there's also similar hues in these colors. So this is perhaps maybe not the best color palette to use. So let's see what happens if we have something with a little bit more intensity, a little bit more brightness perhaps. And then we could also think about maybe making something that is perhaps a little bit less symmetrical, just to take our pattern off kilter a little bit. So another way to get away from that kind of flatness can also be just to have the illusion of something being slightly less modular. And in other words, the pattern working in a way you wouldn't expect the pattern to work in. So as you're making patterns like this, I mean, you can really play with them forever. It's a sort of endless process. And it's a really great way to look at the variations, the possibilities, because on the computer it's very easy to change everything. So you can continually be looking and learning, seeing what happens visually when I change this background color, for instance. Is there suddenly much more depth? Does it feel like there are 3 or 4 different layers pushing towards me? So when you do this, it's really important just to keep playing. There's no right or wrong. We're not really looking for a concrete solution. We're really just looking to learn about playing. And one good way to do that on the computer is to actually build a pattern so that it's complete, and then to take the colors and just play around with them a little bit. So here I'm going to isolate this brown color, and you can see what happens as we start to make it a little bit lighter, a little bit brighter. You can see what a radical difference it has in how the pattern feels, how the depth works, how the colors work, and really the changes in what kind of palette you're building. So here we've got something that's much more flatter, where these elements are going to stand out more. The yellow is perhaps going to stand out more. And you can see as we punch that color back up, it can become much flatter. It'd be interesting to see what happens if we even make that background be very, very dark, and again get these elements to pop out. So there's no real right and wrongs in this case. It's really just experimentation in order to learn. But once you give this pattern some kind of job to do, or something to represent, then suddenly there is a bit more of a criteria for you to think about your design, and to think about what's working, what's not working. And one easy way to do this with form, shape, color, and pattern is to look at historical motifs and historical patterns, and just try and analyze them a little bit, and think about why those patterns look the way they do, what kind of color palettes were perhaps associated with certain time periods or certain movements, even certain countries, certain cultures. And just having that little bit of extra knowledge can really help you get a grasp on the tools and be able to control how you want something to feel, what you want the pattern and the color to reference.
So far in this course, we've broken design down into smaller parts in order to investigate and experience it, to make it understandable and to learn about it. Now we're going to think about how to put some of those component pieces back together again, and we're going to use composition to do that. Historically, composition was at the core of the designer's role. An ad agency might have come up with the concept, a photographer have taken the photo, an illustrator made the image, a typesetter laid out the type, and a copywriter written the text. So what did the designer do? Well, the designer arranged everything on the page. It seems like a small thing, but you can make many designs, both good and bad, with the same elements. the arrangement can dramatically affect the visual appeal of a piece of design. It can also make or break the message that the designer is trying to communicate. Think of it like a room full of furniture. How you arrange the room can dramatically affect your experience of the room, how it feels, how it looks, what it tells you about who lives in the room. And it can be the same pieces of furniture, and it can make you feel like the room is very organized or very messy, spatially comfortable, or really annoying and awkward to be in. Composition can make design be direct, logical, and functional, but composition can also make design feel more complex, engaging, and dense. It can be the difference between success and failure of a piece of design. This week we'll look at the basic principles of composition, how to create and control visual contrast. We'll examine and understand how more complex hierarchical relationships work. Finally, we'll be looking at how to create a more complex piece of design, and we'll be using your knowledge from all of the previous weeks in the course.
Composition is basically the arrangement and positioning of elements on a surface to form a piece of graphic design. So this could be on screen, it could be in print, but basically it's putting together any of those elements. It could be typography, it could be shapes, it could be images. And composition is a very powerful tool. To begin with, it can really make the difference between things not making any sense and exactly the same elements coming together and making sense. But it can also quite subtly affect how a viewer reads things and what kind of messages they're getting from design. So it's not just about arranging all the elements, it's about doing it with some kind of thoughtful intent as the designer, and using composition as a tool really to help you to create messages as well as aesthetics. So let's start out with a blank piece of paper. Imagine we put an element, an object, onto that piece of paper. The chances are that we're going to place that object pretty much in the middle of the paper, and that's just our inclination. Maybe it's a reaction to symmetry and geometry, but that's kind of an even way to place an image on a piece of paper, and probably the most obvious as well. And this is called being centered. And when you center an object in a composition or a series of objects in a composition, it nearly always works okay, but it's also very, very familiar and can lose a lot of its power. So let's imagine we have three different shapes to work with, and we're going to try and compose them in this page. If we were to put them on a centered axis, it might get a little too clumsy and too awkward, so we might have to think of a different way to arrange those elements. So there are a couple of very familiar and very traditional ways of arranging elements. So one being centered, another being something called the rule of thirds. And here you divide your page or your screen that you're working on into a series of thirds, and where the thirds intersect is actually points of visual interest where you might choose to place elements. So you can see here, if we get rid of the grid lines and we look at the placement of shapes onto the intersection of the thirds one at a time, you can really see how they're placed at points of visual interest where the relationship between the object and the rectangle that it's sitting in and the white space where the object isn't, those relationships are quite kind of pleasing to the eye. So these two simple systems, vertical and horizontal symmetry and the rule of thirds, they're really based on a lot of how we see things in nature. Quite often things are symmetrical or things are divided up that they fall into this rule of thirds. But there's another system that's also from nature that's perhaps more interesting to look at, and that system is called the golden rectangle. And this is a system that's been very popular in architecture and in design really since the 1400s. Unlike the other two systems, the golden rectangle is seen as creating a guideline for composition that is really seen as being harmonious, in particular in this case because the ratios of the golden rectangle actually reflect the ratios of the human body. So let's look at how you actually make a golden rectangle. So if you take a square and you cut that square in half, and you then look at the center of the square to a corner of the square, can be either of these. If you think about that as the radius of a circle, and you were to actually draw that circle, what that would give you is another length here. And if you then took that length and actually turned it into a rectangle, what you would actually have is something that was the proportions of the golden rectangle. So you can see that it's always made up of a square and then an additional segment. And the ratio between the height and the length, and this obviously works horizontally as well as vertically, but that ratio between the height and the length is always a consistent proportion. And that proportion is roughly 1 to 1.6. And if you wanted to do a little research about how the golden rectangle is used, the golden section is used in, say, book design, for instance, is very interesting to look at because it's a medium that's been around for such a long time. You can look at book plates from the 15th, 16th century that use this composition, all the way up to books and book designs today that are using this same composition. And one of the interesting things about the golden rectangle is that once you have a square and you make a golden rectangle out of it, the portion that's left, when that's divided up into a square, the piece that's left after that is another golden rectangle. So what this means is you can kind of keep going forever, dividing each golden rectangle up by adding a square to it to get another smaller golden rectangle. And if you kept going for this, what you'd actually end up with would be a perfect nautilus shape. And again, this talks about the relationship of the golden ratio to its form and its appearance in nature. So we could place some objects within certain areas that are defined by the golden ratio, for instance, and that might help us with a composition. But we're also going to need to make other moves in our composition. So for instance, here you can see just scale by making some of the elements larger can have a really large effect, really change the hierarchy. Suddenly the triangle is obviously much more important. Or here we're using direction and space a little bit more, and you can see again the scale where the circle becomes much more important. There's a lot of activity over on the left hand side, a lot more space over on the right hand side. And these kind of compositional ideas, they can really be found out by just moving shapes around within a rectangle. But I think one of the easiest ways to really think about them is to actually talk about visual contrast. And what this means is taking some of these aspects of composition and trying to look at them as a spectrum, if you like, from very little contrast to a lot of contrast. And the reason why we try and do this is to really gain control of them. So we're going to look at this in a very abstract way, and we're just going to use abstract geometric shapes to begin with to think about composition. So we're going to divide visual contrasts up into a list of 6 different categories. Those categories are form, or kind of shape, scale, size relationships, weight, so a difference in tonality, space, how a composition might use negative and positive space, direction, horizontal, vertical, diagonal lines, or how objects point and help you traverse white space, and then texture, the kind of flatness versus the texture or the quality of a certain object. So to begin with, we're going to break these down into single visual contrasts with single forms. So what that means is we're going to take every single aspect of those 6 points, and we're going to look at them with just one shape and see what would make a lot of contrast or a little contrast. So to begin with, if we think about form, here's a shape. It's a single form. There's no real contrast there, and all we're really looking at is the difference between that form, and we're really just trying to accentuate just this one form. There's no scale difference between the forms, there's no tonal difference, there's no directional difference, apart from what might be inherent in the form itself. So we can look at form and talk about differences in form with just single objects. It doesn't necessarily have to be comparative, side by side. But if we look at the next contrast, scale, we really need to see large versus small next to each other because they define one another. So here you can see scale when it's even, so no difference between the two objects, versus obviously a much more exaggerated scale, one object being larger, one object being smaller. But again, we're trying not to allow any other contrast to be visible here, so not a lot of direction, not a lot of spatial or tonal difference or textural difference. So let's look at weight now and try and isolate weight as a contrast. So here you can see we have 2 shapes that are very even, exactly the same tone, they have the same visual weight, which is obviously related to their scale and their form as well. But you can see just by turning one into an outline and leaving the other solid, that one suddenly has, the dark shape has a lot more presence on the page, a lot more contrast, volume, so it appears to have more weight. And obviously we can do this tonally as well. We can look at a 50% shape here and look at the difference between that tonally. And again, it's in terms of contrast, so the shape on the right appears to be visually larger than the shape on the left, and visually heavier as well. So now let's look at space as a contrast. And space isn't necessarily a contrast that can be held within a particular form, so we're not really talking about the difference between each of these two objects as implying a contrast in space. What we're really talking about is a compositional contrast, where here, for instance, by putting those two shapes into one corner, we're creating a lot of white space. So we're really looking at creating a composition here that puts an emphasis on that white space and makes that white space much more visible. But at the same time, because the square shapes are echoing the square of our page and are sitting fairly passively in the corner, there's not a lot of direction happening either. And again, there's no tonality, there's no difference in texture or scale. So what we're really trying to do is just to isolate and emphasize one aspect of the visual contrast list in order to focus on it, but also in order to be able to really understand it and control it. And direction works in a similar way. We're not really looking at direction within an individual shape. Obviously, a square as an even geometric shape pulls you into the center of that shape, whereas a line might actually have a little bit more direction. But we're thinking more about the relationship between the page and the objects that are put on the page. So here, for instance, you can see we're getting a much more diagonal relationship out of these squares. We're starting to get a diagonal direction. So our eye is being led from the center of the page out to the corners here. And you can see you can create that tension, and you can create direction that actually makes the viewer's eye cross white space. And this is the beginning of understanding how elements work in relationship to backgrounds within compositions, how a viewer's eye moves around a composition and that relationship to hierarchy. So for instance, we might be drawn to one of these black shapes, but then our eye is pulled across to the other shape. Texture works a little bit more like some of the earlier contrasts that we were looking at, where texture really relies on the object itself changing rather than its relationship to the page and its position on the page. So for instance, here we can see just a very straightforward black square, whereas the shape to the left has a geometric, a texture to it. And you could exaggerate that even more by perhaps making it be more organic. It could also have a less linear quality to define that shape. So here you can see that we still read this as a square, but that texture is really forcing us to not think about it being quite so geometric as before. So we've looked at single visual contrasts with single forms where possible, and now we're going to look at single visual contrasts with multiple forms. So we can see that pretty much with forms it doesn't really change that much. There's still the idea of these being different but comparative shapes, different but comparative forms. And if we look at weight, we could see now, rather than having just either end of the spectrum, we have a little bit more of a range. So here we can see from white to grey to black in terms of tonality and visual weight. But where this is perhaps a little more interesting is when we start to look at, again, those compositional elements or aspects that deal much more with the object versus the background rather than comparing to each other. So here, for instance, with space, you can clearly see how these four black squares now really make the negative space, the white cross that you can see. They've really created that space, and there's this really interesting tension and relationship between the push and the pull, the foreground and background, between the white and the black. In a similar way, if we look at direction, you can see that by now we have more shapes to work with. We can really get them to describe the aspect of composition that we're trying to get at. So here, for instance, these 5 black squares clearly form a very strong diagonal line that talks about direction within the frame. So when we look at scale with more elements, you can see that what's happening is we've got a much greater range now, so we're starting to build more of a rhythm and more of a pattern and repetition. And so this allows us to actually see the range of the scale and see how scale is really working a little bit more easily. It actually makes it more clearer to see. And finally, if we look at texture with more than one element or two elements at a time, we can start to have a greater comparison and a greater variety of different kinds of texture that might be possible. Now, looking at all of these different aspects of composition individually isn't really going to help us be that much better at composition, because when you're composing, all of those aspects of composition are happening at the same time. So what we're going to try and do next is to start to combine some of these aspects of composition and see how they work together. So this is where things start to get a little bit more interesting and a little bit more fun, I think. We've looked at single visual contrasts and we've tried to look at them with both single and multiple forms, but now we're going to actually look at multiple visual contrasts using multiple forms. And this is a more realistic representation of how you might compose and put things on a page. So instead of trying to isolate these visual contrasts to understand them, we're really going to try and mix and match them a little bit more. So let's start out with two very simple ones. Let's start with mixing scale and form together. So here you can see we've got two different forms, two different shapes, two different objects, but they've also got two different scales working as well. So that's quite simple, but immediately a little bit more visually interesting. And now we can see what happens if we add a little bit of texture to these same objects. So we have scale, form, and texture all working together. So you can see now it starts to get even more interesting. So there's a little bit of dimensionality, there's an extra contrast happening there with the texture, and sometimes you can think about these contrasts as being visual interest as well. So the more we add to a certain extent, the more visually interesting the composition is going to be. So if we keep going now and we try and add some direction to our other elements, you can see we've added a third element here, the triangle. And now we've clearly got, even though we've got differences in scale and differences in form and differences in texture, they're unifying in this very strong diagonal relationship. So let's try and combine two other aspects of contrast in composition. Let's try weight and form. So here we have three different forms, three different objects, shapes, and they have three different tonal values to them. So it's still fairly flat, fairly conventional. Let's see what happens if we try and add a little bit of space as one of our compositional considerations. So here now you can see they're not sitting on a consistent line anymore, and they're actually interacting with each other and interacting with the background in a little bit more of an interesting way. So the angle of the triangle could be pointing at the circle. The square here is getting a little bit of tension, visual tension, where it's close to the edge. And you really notice the difference between the tonal value of the three of them, and because of the composition your eye tends to travel between the three of them as well. So now let's see what happens if we add a little bit of scale to this as well to try and reduce the flatness that was there. So now you can see the composition suddenly feels much more interesting. There's a lot more depth to it. You're not quite sure whether that depth perception is the push and pull of scale or of tonality, and whether this becomes a little bit more pictorial or not. The relationships between the shapes, as soon as you start to sit one shape on top of another, it has a certain realism or a certain gravity to it. So we could try and keep going and add one more aspect. So in this case, let's try adding direction and see what happens with that. So now if we put those shapes in a new composition that looks a little bit more like direction, you can see we're back to a less pictorial representation, but again we've got a little bit more of a diagonal, directional relationship between the three shapes. So the square remains very static and heavy, partly due to its shape, partly due to its weight, and also its position in the frame. The triangle feels a little more floating and obviously has a directional aspect to it that points at the square. And then the circle, which is concentric shape that can kind of suck you in visually, like that feels much more like a focal point or a starting point for the composition. So you might look at this and then travel out to the square. So let's see what happens now if we keep going with this and we try and work with all of the different aspects of composition that we have. What you can see is that we've got a lot going on. We've got a lot of direction, we've got some trapped white space, we've got scale, texture, tonality. There's a lot of contrasts happening there. So this makes the composition quite active in a lot of the areas. So you can see the activity here is in the texture, and yet we've got a lot of diagonals here pointing at different things. This line is very strong. Then it's leading you into a more calm little area of white space where this dot is held. We've got a large dark area as a contrast to that. So you can see that we're making all of the different aspects of composition work, but that can sometimes create a little bit of a cacophony, a lot of visual noise. So part of what you could think about is how to now rein in some of those aspects of composition and to actually control them, and maybe decide that you want some of them to do a little bit less and decide which ones you really want to do more of the hard work. So I might decide here that I think this black square and the textured circle are cancelling each other out a little bit. So I might decide I want a little bit more space. So I might reduce the scale of that black square and increase the scale of the white triangle. And you can see that that has quite a different effect on how you read the composition. Now you've got a lot more white space to look at in the lower half of the composition. The white triangle is now a much more prevalent part of the composition as well. So once you've got a lot of complexity and you've got a lot of elements going on, sometimes just one small move can really make a difference. And we could keep going further with this idea of trying to get a little bit more space, a little bit more contrast in the space, if you like. So now in this composition we're taking some of those floating elements that are out in the white space, the circle and the square, and actually grouping those together a little bit, layering them on top of each other, so starting to get a little bit of depth that way. And here you can see we're creating some tension in the composition as well, between the circle here that's a very powerful, strong, contrasting element with the white triangle on top of it. A lot of the direction is coming from both triangle shapes, and we're using this bar to kind of bounce back that directionality. And the same thing is happening up here in the corner. Our eyes might kind of trickle up here, and this sort of 45-degree shape of the square is going to bounce us back down, same over here, and bounce our eye back into the composition. And sometimes you want that in a composition. You want the viewer's eye to keep moving. So part of this is really about controlling hierarchy, and part of it is also controlling what the viewer looks at when. And here's one last variation just for fun, where we take away a lot of the scale, we take away a lot of the overlapping, and you can see that this now feels like a much flatter, a much more graphic composition, even though it's the same elements really, but the reduction in scale, the reduction in overlapping really makes this feel very, very different than the previous composition, which feels almost like it could exist in the real world. It feels like it starts to have a little bit of depth and perspective, whereas this feels very much like a flat world, a two-dimensional world. But I still think there's a lot happening in the composition here that could be seen as being really interesting. You start to notice some other things. For instance, the relationship between these two circles is now accentuated because they're on a similar central axis, so your eye is encouraged to jump over this white space. You're then also encouraged by this diagonal and the diagonal line that these elements create to have a relationship between this grey circle and the other elements down here. So your eye can kind of move through that composition. And you can also see here is a point of tension where these 3 points come together, and there's some negative space forming shapes as well. And all of these things, it takes a little while to get used to them, but as you're actually making compositions of your own, it really helps to talk about them and critique them on your own and try and really figure out how they're working, figure out what direction your eye is looking in, what areas of the composition are active, what areas of the composition are passive or static. So we've looked at how to use contrasts for creating compositions using abstract shapes, and now I'm going to take some of those same compositions and just switch the abstract shapes, switch those graphic forms out for typographic forms. So let's start out by looking at scale and form. So before we'd had a very large circle and a very small square, so if we were to replace those with typographic forms, we might get a composition that looked something like this. And the reason why I'm going to very quickly do this with type and switch it out is just to kind of illustrate some of the same concepts and how those concepts in composition work with letter forms as opposed to objects. So in this case we'd be looking at the letters O and the letter H as being different forms. They would be the same typeface, but actually the form would be the letters that we're choosing. So if we then start to think about how to add texture, that would really be about the kind of typeface that we were choosing. So you can see here that one typeface is a sans serif, the other's a very decorative ornamental initial cap. So there's two very, very different feelings to how those typefaces are drawn to kind of the texture of the letter form. So now if we keep going and try and look at scale, form, texture, and direction with type, you can see we're starting to get a composition that feels that it's working in a similar way to how we looked with objects. You're getting direction out of certain shapes of letter forms, like the A, for instance. The B has some formal qualities very different from the other letters. And so we can use what we've learned in our composition class and really use that as a way to experiment with type and look at typographic form as well. So let's take one of the other examples that we looked at. We looked at weight and form together, and we'd looked at 3 different shapes with 3 different tones to them. So again, we could look at perhaps 3 different typefaces with 3 different weights to each letter form. If we then start to look at how those might work in terms of how they're composed within space, we can see that again we're disrupting legibility at this point. We're no longer sure where to start reading, but the letter forms now become a little bit more like elements in the composition. So as we add other aspects of composition, we add scale here, and then we add some direction to the composition. You can see that these typographic elements, when they're broken down into single letters, they actually function in a very, very similar way to how the objects were functioning in our other compositions. Where it changes and they function a little bit less is when we start to reach a level of complexity where again the form becomes a little bit noisy and a little bit overwhelming. And part of the reason why we're not really used to this with typography, apart from perhaps in ransom notes, is because we're not used to seeing single letters in different typefaces. We're used to seeing words in different typefaces. So at this stage it becomes quite difficult to think about this as typography, and it becomes a little bit more like lettering, working really with just letters in a composition. So at this stage I'm not really thinking about legibility or readability, how things make sense or if they even say anything. I'm just looking at the letter forms as forms. You could actually counteract this a little bit if you took away that typographic cacophony. If we look at this composition, for instance, and we tried to replicate this one typographically, and we did it with actually a family of typefaces, so here it's all in universe, for instance, suddenly it feels a little bit more harmonious. And so perhaps when working with letter forms in this way, a better strategy might be to work with a family that has a broad range, a lot of different weights and a lot of different condensed and extended versions, rather than working with a range of different typefaces. So we've looked at how multiple visual contrasts work with type. So now let's have a look at how some of these multiple visual contrasts work with images. I'm going to use some of the images that I just have lying around from our very first image making class. So if we looked at something like scale and form, for instance, and before we'd looked at a large circle and a small square, if we just transpose those